They fired him at 11:47 p.m., not because he stole anything, not because he lied, but because a man in a janitor's uniform had no business sitting beside the CEO's daughter teaching her how to play piano. His badge was taken. His box was set outside the door. And the 9-year-old blind girl who had, for the first time in her life, found something beautiful in her darkness, stood crying alone in the hallway, her hands still curved in the shape of keys she was no longer allowed to touch. This is a story about what snap judgment can destroy and what music can save. If you're watching this, hit like and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay until the end, because the last moment of this story will make you understand why sometimes the only person who truly sees you is the one the whole world looks right through. The lobby of Nexagen Technologies at midnight looked nothing like it did during business hours. During the day, it was all polished marble and controlled energy. Receptionists with headsets, couriers moving in tight, efficient lines, executives in tailored suits who never made eye contact with anyone whose badge didn't match their color code. At midnight, it was just a building, quiet, indifferent, the kind of quiet that has weight. Liam Carter pushed his mop cart through the main corridor of the 42nd floor, the wheels making a low rhythmic squeak that he'd stopped hearing somewhere around week 3 of this job. His earbuds were in, not playing anything, just blocking out the ambient hum of the HVAC system that buzzed at a frequency he didn't like. The silence he built for himself was imperfect, but it was his. He was 32 years old, 5'11", the kind of man you'd look at once and immediately forget, which was something he'd cultivated deliberately over the past few years. He wore his dark hair short, kept his face shaved just often enough that he didn't look unkempt, and moved through the building with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned, the hard way, that being noticed in the wrong context costs more than it's worth. His janitor uniform was always clean. That was the one thing he was particular about. The pants pressed, the shirt collar straight. It was a small, private stubbornness that had no audience and didn't need one. His hands were the only thing that didn't match the rest of him. His knuckles were rough from the cleaning chemicals. The skin around his right thumb cracked and perpetually slow to heal, but his fingers were long and careful in a way that suggested they had been trained for something other than gripping a mop handle. They had. He didn't talk about that. It was easier, far easier, not to. The 42nd floor was executive territory. VP offices, 2 private boardrooms, a kitchen stocked like a boutique hotel, and at the far end of the east hallway, a door he had walked past exactly 117 times without ever opening. He had counted, not because he was obsessive, but because counting things was what his brain did when he was trying not to think about something else. The door had a small brass plate on it. Private music room. Restricted access. He had assumed it was decorative, the kind of gesture tech companies made to signal that they cared about wellness and culture, while keeping the door locked tight enough that nobody would actually use it. Tonight the door was open. Not wide, just barely cracked, the way something swings when someone forgets to pull it completely shut behind them. And from that narrow gap, barely audible over the distant hum of the building cooling itself down for the night, came sound. Piano. Liam stopped walking. His hands tightened on the mop handle. Not a decision, just a reflex, the way your body responds to a smell that belongs to a different room in your memory. He stood in the middle of the hallway and listened. The playing was slow and hesitant, halting in a specific way that told him this wasn't a beginner fumbling through something new. This was someone who knew exactly what the music was supposed to sound like and couldn't make their hands produce it. You could hear the difference. A beginner's mistakes are shapeless, scattered. This playing had direction, intention, and frustration. Every stumble was followed by a fraction of a second pause that wasn't confusion. It was recognition. I know that was wrong. I know what right sounds like. He knew that particular silence. He had lived inside it for years. He should have kept moving. 4 months on this job had burned a set of rules into him that operated below conscious thought. Don't linger, don't engage. Don't be in a place you're not explicitly supposed to be when anyone with a different color badge walks by. Executive floor after 10 p.m. was technically part of his cleaning rotation, but technically within your rotation, and welcome here, were 2 entirely different things. And Liam had learned that particular distinction the hard way. in a city 400 miles from here, in a situation he had spent 3 years attempting to stop dreaming about. He stood in the hallway and listened to the piano struggle through the same 4-bar passage a second time, then a third. On the fourth attempt, something in the left hand collapsed entirely. A chord that should have resolved and instead fell apart, and there was a sound that escaped from behind the door that wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a word. It was the sound of someone very young, sitting completely alone, hitting the specific wall where effort and inability meet, and there's nothing left to do but feel it. Liam pushed the door open. The room was small, expensive but small. Someone had made real decisions about this space. The piano was a Yamaha Concert Grand, its black lacquered surface reflecting the soft overhead lighting, taking up most of the room in the way a well-chosen piece of furniture does, claiming space without apology. The walls were lined with acoustic paneling in dark gray fabric. There was a bench, properly upholstered, and sitting on it was a child who looked completely wrong in this setting. Not because she was out of place, but because the room was formal and adult, and she was 9 years old with a braid that had mostly come undone, a school uniform jacket sitting slightly sideways on her shoulders, and her hands resting motionless on the keys. Her eyes were closed, not closed in concentration, closed in the way of someone for whom closed was simply the default state of things. She hadn't heard him come in. The door had been well oiled and his sneakers were soft, and she was turned inward, murmuring to herself in a low voice, just barely above a whisper. Measure 16. E flat to D. You know where D is. You know where D is. Just reach, and you do know where D is, Liam said. The girl's hands yanked back from the keys and into her lap in one sharp, startled motion. Her head came up fast, chin tilting slightly past him in a way that told him immediately she was triangulating from sound, calculating distance and position from audio alone, the way someone does when their eyes have never been part of that equation. Who's there? Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful. He could hear what it cost her. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. I didn't mean to startle you. I work here as night shift, maintenance. I heard the piano, and the door was already open, so He stopped. I'll go. I shouldn't have come in. Are you security? No, I clean things. She processed that. He watched her posture shift, subtle but real, the kind of micro-adjustment a person makes when they reclassify a threat. You're not going to make me leave? Not really my call to make. Another pause. Then something in her shoulders dropped, a held breath quality releasing from her posture. I'm not supposed to be here either, she said. Not this late. Marguerite thinks I'm asleep. She checks at midnight, but it's only 11:30. Marguerite your sitter? She prefers caretaker. The corner of Sophie's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. My name is Sophie. Liam. You play piano, Liam? He hadn't expected the question. It landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there for a moment before he answered. What makes you ask that? You didn't ask about my eyes, she said simply. Most adults do it within the first 30 seconds. Either you already knew, or you're very polite, or you were paying attention to something else entirely, and she tilted her head slightly. You said I know where D is before I told you what measure I was working on. You heard it in the playing. Liam was quiet for a moment. Then he walked across the room and sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving clear space between them. Schumann, he said, Kinderszenen. That passage. The problem is the left-hand voicing. It feels like a step, but it's actually a stretch, and if you approach it like a step, you'll keep landing short. Sophie's face turned toward him. Not quite at him, slightly past, but oriented in his direction, attentive in a way that was almost physical in its intensity. Can you show me? She said. He looked at the keys for a long moment. He hadn't touched a piano in 3 years. He hadn't planned to think about that tonight, but his hands were already moving. Not because he decided to let them, but because some things in the body don't wait for decisions. His fingers found the passage the way feet find a familiar floor in the dark. Muscle memory. The Schumann came out slowly, then at full tempo, then broken into pieces. Right hand, then left, then together. and he could feel the muscle memory in his hands like something that had been sleeping and was now, reluctantly, waking up. Sophie listened with her whole body. She didn't move. She didn't nod along or make any of the small performative sounds people make when they want you to know they're listening. She was completely still, head slightly tilted, the kind of total attention that most adults have trained themselves out of. When he stopped, she said, "Can I put my hands on top of yours?" "Yeah." "Okay." She reached toward him carefully, found the back of his right hand and laid her fingers over his. Barely any weight to them at all. He played the passage again. Slowly. Her fingers followed his across the keys, reading the motion like raised text, the geography of the melody translating itself through her palms and fingertips. He could feel her processing it, the tiny adjustments in pressure as she traced specific intervals, the pause when his hand shifted position for the stretch he'd been describing. When he finished, she pulled her hands back and was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he'd lost her somewhere. "The D is further right than I was reaching," she said finally. "Yeah. I was thinking of it as a step. It's actually a stretch." "Exactly." She found the keys herself, placed her hands with a precision that made clear how many hours she had spent at this instrument, and played the passage. The tempo wobbled. The left hand was still imperfect, but the chord resolved. The harmony landed where Schumann had put it, where it had been waiting all along. Sophie let out a breath that came from somewhere deep. "I've been trying to get that for 6 days," she said quietly. Liam didn't answer right away. He understood that sentence in a way that didn't require response, the way you understand something you've carried yourself. "Play it again," he said instead. She played it again. Better. The wobble in the tempo was smaller, the stretch was more confident. She played it a third time, and he listened without saying anything, letting her find it in her own hands without guidance. And on the third pass, something clicked. Some internal calibration that only the player can feel. And the passage came out clean and whole and true. Sophie stopped playing. She sat very still with her hands in her lap. "That's the first time it's felt right," she said. Her voice was different, quieter, more careful, like she was handling something fragile. "I didn't think it was going to feel like anything. I thought it was just notes. My teacher said to count it differently, and my other teacher said to slow down, and Marguerite said maybe the piece is too hard, and—" She stopped. "But it felt like something just now." "It does that sometimes," Liam said. "Music does that. Most of the time you're just working, and then suddenly you're not just working anymore, and the difference is—" He paused. He hadn't talked about this in a long time. He hadn't let himself. "The difference is real. It's not in your head." Sophie turned toward him again. "How long have you played?" "Since I was 6. "Do you still play? I mean, not tonight, in general." He looked at the piano keys. They were ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, the way all familiar things are when you've been away from them long enough. "Not really," he said. "Not for a while." "Why not?" The question was direct in the way children's questions are. No padding around it, no social awareness that some doors are closed for a reason. He didn't answer it. He looked at the clock on the wall instead. "It's 11:52, he said. "Marguerite checks at midnight." Sophie made a face, and a quick, unguarded grimace that was so purely childlike that it caught him off guard. She slid off the bench, moving with a practiced economy across the room, one hand trailing lightly along the edge of the piano and then finding the wall, navigating the space with the quiet confidence of someone who has long since made peace with finding their way differently than other people do. At the door, she stopped. "Liam," she said. "Yeah." "Will you be here tomorrow night?" He thought about every sensible thing. He thought about his rotation schedule, the executive floor, the brass plate on the door, the rules that existed for reasons, and the rules that existed for reasons of a different kind. He thought about the chord that had finally resolved after 6 days of being broken. "I'll be here," he said. He stayed in the music room for 10 minutes after she left. He didn't play anything. He just sat on the bench and rested his hands on the keys without pressing them, feeling the cool smoothness of the ivory under his fingers, the slight give of the action when you touch without committing. The building hummed around him. Somewhere below, the city went on doing what cities do at midnight, being large and indifferent, and full of people alone in their own ways. He picked up his mop and his cart and finished his shift. But something about the way he moved through the remaining hours of the night was different, though he couldn't have said exactly how. He went home at 6 in the morning to a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was affordable and not much else. The living room had a couch and a second-hand bookshelf, and a small kitchen table with 3 chairs because he'd bought the set before he understood that they would only ever need 2. The third chair was pushed against the wall and had a backpack on it most days. His daughter's backpack, pink with a keychain of a small yellow rabbit attached to the zipper. Chosen by her, defended aggressively against his suggestion that maybe a different color would show less dirt. Lily Carter was 7 years old and asleep in her room when he came home, which was the arrangement. The apartment was small enough that he could hear if she woke up while he worked, and their neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, had a key for emergencies, and the kind of concerned, reliable warmth that Liam had come to depend on in ways he didn't fully examine. He changed out of his work clothes, started coffee, and sat at the kitchen table while it brewed, looking at nothing in particular. He thought about Sophie playing Schumann at 11:30 at night in a locked room on the 42nd floor of a building where her mother ran 12,000 employees. He thought about the way she had murmured to herself, "You know where Dee is, you know," the private pep talk of someone who had learned to be their own coach because the other coaches weren't always there. He recognized that too. He recognized it in a way that sat uncomfortably behind his sternum. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:45, still in her pajamas, hair vertical on one side, dragging her stuffed elephant by its ear with the casual violence of the recently awakened. She looked at him with the specific evaluating squint she'd developed around age 5 and deployed whenever she was trying to determine if he was okay without having to ask directly. "You made coffee," she said. "I did." "You only make coffee when something happened." "Something's always happening, Lil. I was at work all night." She considered this. She climbed onto the chair across from him, not the chair against the wall, never that one, by some unspoken mutual agreement, and put her elephant on the table facing her like a tiny patient audience. "What happened at work?" she asked. "Nothing much." "Dad?" He looked at her. 7 years old, her mother's eyes, her grandmother's stubbornness, and an instinct for when he was being evasive that would have been professionally useful if applied anywhere other than at him. "I met a kid," he said. "She plays piano." "Is she good?" "She's going to be." Lily absorbed this. "Did you play?" she asked carefully. "A little." His daughter looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and patted his hand twice, very deliberately, very seriously. The way someone pats the hand of a person who needs reassurance but shouldn't be made to feel fragile about needing it. "Good," she said, and pulled her elephant closer to pour it a pretend cup of coffee from her cupped palm. He watched her do this and felt something move through him that he couldn't name precisely. Something that had to do with how much a person can lose and still have things that matter. He poured her a real glass of orange juice and started making eggs, and didn't say anything more about the piano. But he thought about it. That night, going in for his shift, he thought about it. Walking through the lobby, past the security desk where Gerald worked and always had a coffee he didn't offer to share, in the elevator that played soft instrumental music no one had chosen. He thought about the way Sophie had laid her hands over his and read the geography of the melody through touch alone. He thought about the chord resolving. He thought about the way she had said it felt like something with that careful, fragile quality, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say it. He clocked in, collected his cart, started on the lower floors. The building had its own rhythm at night. The security guard rounds, the HVAC cycling, the occasional email that someone in a different time zone needed to send at 2 in the morning, and that caused an office light to glow unexpectedly at the end of a dark hall. He knew the rhythm now. He moved with it. He finished his rotation on the lower floors by 10:15. Technically, he had latitude in the order he cleaned the executive floor. Technically, he could go there whenever it fit within his shift. The music room door was cracked open. He stood in the hallway and listened and heard the Schumann, different tonight. She'd moved past the passage they'd worked on and was somewhere further into the piece, feeling her way through new territory. He pushed the door open. Sophie looked up from the keys. She didn't look up exactly. She oriented, her face angling toward the sound of the door, and the expression that crossed her face was brief and unguarded and real. "You came back," she said. "Told you I would." Adults say that a lot. She turned back to the piano. They don't always mean it. He sat down on the bench. He didn't say anything about the implications of that statement. He just looked at where her hands were positioned on the keys and said, "Show me what you're working on." She showed him. That night, they worked for an hour and 20 minutes. The night after that, an hour and 40. The pattern established itself the way habits do, not through decision, but through repetition, each instance making the next one feel less unusual, less deliberate. By the end of the second week, Liam had stopped thinking of it as something he was choosing to do and started thinking of it simply as something that happened, like his daughter's rabbit keychain and his cracked thumb and Gerald's hoarded coffee. He learned things about Sophie in pieces, the way you learn things about a person who is careful with information. She was 9, she told him, which he'd guessed correctly. She had been blind from birth, not partially, not as the result of an accident or illness, just simply blind, the way some people are left-handed or afraid of heights. It was the condition of her life, and she had arranged herself around it so completely that explaining it to sighted people was less a matter of describing a limitation and more a matter of correcting a misunderstanding. She was not navigating darkness, she told him crisply during their third lesson, when he used the word. She was navigating the world, the same as everyone else, with different tools. She had been taking piano lessons since she was 4. Standard lessons, a standard teacher, the standard approach. Sheet music adapted into Braille notation, proper technique emphasized, a repertoire appropriate to her age and level. Her teacher was qualified and kind and had taught her to play the piano in the same way that a driving instructor teaches someone to parallel park. Technically correct. Effectively useful. Missing something. What Sophie had, and what Liam recognized immediately because he'd had it himself at her age, and had spent years trying to cultivate it before understanding it was either there or it wasn't, was the capacity to feel music structurally. To hear a piece not as a sequence of notes, but as a thing with weight and shape and movement, the way a building has a shape when you're inside it. Most pianists develop this gradually, through years of study. Sophie seemed to have been born with the template and was simply waiting for someone to show her how to fill it in. Her formal teacher had been filling in sections. Good sections. Clean work. Liam started teaching her the architecture. He taught her the way his own teacher had taught him, not by explaining theory, but by demonstrating consequence. Listen to what happens when I do this. Feel the difference between these two voicings. What does the music want to do here? Where is it pulling? He taught her to find the emotional logic of a piece first, and let the technical execution follow from that logic, rather than the reverse. He had her play passages blindfolded, and then caught himself and said, "I'm sorry, that's a stupid exercise for you specifically." And she laughed for the first time in his presence, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and said, "I'm always blindfolded, Liam." He laughed too. It surprised him. They worked on the Schumann until it was fluid and then moved to Chopin, which gave her trouble in different ways. The rubato, the freedom of tempo that was built into the style and that sounded either beautiful or self-indulgent, depending entirely on whether the player understood what they were expressing. Sophie had the instinct, but not yet the control. He had her sing the melody while playing the left hand alone. He had her conduct herself, literally wave her right hand in the air to feel the push and pull of the tempo while her left hand held the rhythm steady. These were teaching methods he half remembered from his own childhood and half invented in the moment, stitched together from what he could see she needed. She was a remarkable student, not because she was talented, though she was genuinely, but because she had been waiting for this specific kind of teaching for years and recognized it when it arrived. She came to each lesson having worked on what they'd discussed. She asked questions that were precise and often caught him off guard, not because they were difficult, but because they revealed that she'd been thinking about the music independently, taking it apart in her own way between sessions, and the questions came from that private work. Once she asked him why Chopin's nocturnes felt like they were about loneliness, even in the major key passages, and he sat with that for a long moment before answering, And the answer he eventually gave was more honest than he usually was with anyone. Because Chopin was a long way from home, he said. Poland. He left, and he never went back. And I think you can hear that he knew he wasn't going back. Even in the beautiful moments, especially in the beautiful moments, there's something underneath it that's about being somewhere that isn't where you belong. Sophie was quiet. Then, do you know what that feels like? Yeah, he said. I do. She didn't ask him to explain. She just nodded, turned back to the keys, and played the nocturne. And something in her playing that night was different. Not technically, but in the way that the technically intangible things are real and audible if you know how to listen for them. She had found something in the music that she hadn't been looking for, and it had found its way into her hands. After lessons, he stayed and finished his shift. Before lessons, on the nights when he arrived early enough, he sometimes sat alone in the music room for a few minutes before she arrived. He didn't always play. Sometimes he just sat on the bench and let his hands rest on the keys and thought about nothing specifically, which was the closest to rest he got in those months. But sometimes, more and more frequently as the weeks went on, he played. Not pieces he was teaching her. His own things, parts of a concerto he had written in pieces over the course of 3 years and never finished. Passages that he'd thought were gone, dissolved into the general accumulation of a life lived differently, and that turned out to have merely been waiting, filed somewhere he didn't have regular access to. The music was still there, all of it. This made him feel things he didn't have a clean word for. At home, Lily noticed. Not the music room, he hadn't told her about that. But she noticed that he was different, in the way children notice changes in the emotional weather of the adults they depend on. She started asking, at dinner, if he was happy, not in the anxious, worried way of a child who suspects something is wrong, but in the genuinely curious way of someone observing an unfamiliar condition and wanting to understand it. I think so, he told her. Yeah, I think so. Because of the piano girl? Partly. What's the other part? He looked at his daughter across their small kitchen table, at the rabbit keychain on her backpack hanging from the back of her chair, at the third chair against the wall that still had her backpack on it from this morning. Because I remembered something, he said. I forgot it for a while, and I remembered it. What did you forget? He thought about how to answer that in a way that was true and also appropriate for a 7-year-old at dinner time. That I know how to do something important, he said finally. Lily considered this with the full gravity she brought to information she determined was significant. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and returned to her mashed potatoes, and Liam watched her eat and thought about 32 years of a life and what it meant that the most alive he'd felt in 3 of them was on a corporate executive floor at midnight, teaching Chopin to a blind 9-year-old while the city slept around them. He thought about this a lot in those weeks. He didn't think, not once, about what would happen if someone opened the door and found them there. He should have. He knew the rules. He had learned them the hard way, in circumstances that had cost him more than this job was worth. But something about those evening hours in the music room, the specific quality of Sophie's attention, the way the Chopin was taking shape under her hands, the way his own hands were beginning to remember what they'd known, made the rest of the world feel less immediate than it actually was. That was the thing about music. It had always done that to him, made the other room seem further away than it was, until the night the other room came in. It was a Wednesday. Liam had arrived on the 42nd floor at 10:50, 15 minutes later than usual after a spill on the 39th floor that had taken longer than it should have. Sophie was already at the piano, working through a Debussy passage he'd introduced the week before, and the music was reaching him from the hallway before he even got to the door. Complex and liquid, not yet mastered but alive with effort and intent. And he was already thinking about what they'd work on tonight, already mentally approaching the session the way he approached all of them, from inside it. He pushed the door open. He saw Sophie at the piano. He saw the music on her face, the absorbed interior expression she got when she was deep in a passage, when the world outside the sound contracted to nearly nothing. He saw the man standing in the doorway of the private office at the far end of the room. The man was in his mid-50s, navy suit, expensive. The kind of posture that came from decades of being in rooms where his opinion mattered and knowing it. He was holding a tablet in one hand and a glass of something amber in the other, and he was looking at the scene in front of him with an expression that moved through surprise and into something harder in the space of about 2 seconds. His eyes went from Sophie at the piano to Liam in the doorway. They moved over Liam's uniform, the push broom in his hand, the cart in the hallway behind him. They stayed there for a moment, on the uniform specifically, on what the uniform meant, and then they moved back to Sophie, who had stopped playing when she heard the door and was now sitting very still with her hands in her lap. "Sophie," the man said. His voice was measured and quiet in the way that quiet can be more dangerous than loud. "Go back to your floor." "Mr. Hargrove, now please." Sophie slid off the bench. She moved toward the door, toward Liam, and when she was close enough, she reached out and found his arm with her hand and held it for a moment, 1 second, 2, before she let go and moved past him into the hallway. Her face was controlled in a way that was painful to see on a child. Richard Hargrove waited until her footsteps had faded down the hall. Then he set his glass down on the nearest surface, placed his tablet beside it, and looked at Liam with the kind of patience that doesn't actually contain any. "Explain to me," he said, "exactly what you were doing in here." Liam looked at him. He thought about explaining. He thought about saying, teaching and watching what happened to Hargrove's expression and deciding ahead of time that it wouldn't matter. He thought about the passage he'd heard Sophie playing in the hallway. He thought about the fact that he had known, somewhere below conscious awareness, that this was always going to happen. "My name is Liam Carter," he said. "I'm on the night maintenance rotation." "I know who you are," Hargrove said. "What I asked is what you were doing in this room." "I was teaching her a piece she was having trouble with." Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that wasn't rage. It was more deliberate than that. "You don't work in this room," he said. "You don't have clearance for this floor after 10 p.m. except for your designated rotation. And you certainly—" He stopped. Precise. Controlled. "You certainly have no business spending private after-hours time with this child. Do you understand the implications of what I'm saying?" Liam understood the implications. He understood them completely and in multiple directions simultaneously. What Hargrove was suggesting, what Hargrove was probably not intending to suggest but would use if he needed to, and what any of it mattered in the context of a conversation where the conclusion had already been reached before the first sentence. "I understand," Liam said. He was called down to the security office at 11:15. He sat across from the night security supervisor, a man named Denton, who Liam had exchanged pleasant nothings with for 4 months, and who now was very carefully not making eye contact, and listened while Hargrove had a phone call with someone Liam never saw or identified, and then Denton slid a form across the desk and said, "Mr. Carter, we're going to need your badge." The box of his few personal items, a spare pair of sneakers, a paperback, a photograph of Lily he'd kept taped to the inside of his locker, was waiting for him by the security exit when they were done. It was 11:47. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and held the box against his chest and looked at the building for a moment. 42 floors of lit glass in the midnight sky, indifferent and enormous, doing what large things do, which is simply continue existing. Then he walked to the parking structure, got in his car, and drove home. He sat in the parking lot of his apartment complex for a while before going inside. He sat in the dark and didn't think about the music, and thought about the music. He thought about Sophie's hands over his on the keys, reading the melody through her palms. He thought about the Debussy he'd heard from the hallway, liquid and complex and alive. He thought about Lily at breakfast, patting his hand twice, her elephant watching from the table. He thought about the passage in the concerto he'd never finished. The third movement, which had always given him trouble, not technically but emotionally, because he'd never been sure what it was supposed to resolve into, what the ending of that particular thing was supposed to feel like. He didn't know yet. He still didn't know. He went inside, checked on Lily, and went to bed without eating, which was something he tried not to do and sometimes did anyway. He stared at the ceiling for a while. The apartment was quiet in the particular way apartments are when the only sounds are ordinary ones. The refrigerator, a car on the street outside, his own breathing. He was still awake when Lily got up at 6:45. She found him at the kitchen table, though no coffee this time, just sitting there in yesterday's work clothes, and she looked at him for a moment with those evaluating eyes And then she came and sat in the chair across from him without saying anything and put her elephant on the table between them, facing him, which was unusual. Normally, the elephant faced her. "What?" he said. "It's facing you today," she said, "so it can keep you company." Liam looked at his daughter, 7 years old, eyes that contained more than they should at this age. He reached out and touched the elephant's small velvet ear. "I lost the job," he said. Lily was quiet for a long moment. "Because of the piano girl?" "Yeah." She nodded slowly, processing. "Is she okay?" He thought about Sophie standing in the hallway outside the security office, her face composed in that controlled, painful way. "I don't know," he said honestly. Lily was quiet again. Then she reached across the table and this time didn't pat his hand but just placed hers over it and left it there, warm and small, the way Sophie had placed her hands over his to read the melody. Different hands. The same gesture, essentially. One person reaching toward another through the only medium available. He turned his hand over and held his daughter's hand, and they sat like that in the early morning quiet while the light changed outside the window. And he didn't say anything about music, and neither did she. And the third chair against the wall was still there with the backpack on it. And somewhere in the upper floors of a building on the other side of the city, a 9-year-old girl sat in a room with a piano that she was no longer allowed to touch after midnight, waiting for something she didn't yet have words for. 3 days after Liam lost his job, Sophie stopped eating breakfast. Not dramatically. Not in any way that announced itself. She simply came to the table in the morning, looked at whatever Marguerite had prepared and rearranged it on the plate with her fork until enough time had passed that she could reasonably ask to be excused. Marguerite noticed on the second day and mentioned it. Sophie said she wasn't hungry. Marguerite, who was 53 and had been caring for Sophie since she was 4 and had developed a finely calibrated sense of which battles were worth fighting, made a note of it and decided to give it another day before escalating. She didn't know what had happened. Sophie hadn't told her. Sophie hadn't told anyone. What Sophie had done on the night of the firing was stand in the hallway outside the security office for 11 minutes. She'd counted, not because she was tracking time, but because counting was what her brain defaulted to when it was trying to hold itself together. She heard voices through the door, Hargrove's flat, measured tone, and someone else's quieter responses, and she understood what was happening in the way that children understand things they haven't been explicitly told. She understood it completely, and found that understanding to be intolerable, and stood in the hallway anyway because there was nowhere else to go. She'd felt Liam's arm when she passed him in the doorway. She'd held it for a moment, just a moment, long enough to communicate something she didn't have language for, and then let go because holding on wasn't going to change anything, and she knew that. Even at 9 years old, she knew that. And the knowing was its own kind of painful. Marguerite had found her back in her room at midnight, sitting on the edge of her bed in her school clothes with her hands in her lap, not crying, not doing anything. She'd asked if Sophie was all right. Sophie had said yes. Marguerite had changed her into pajamas and tucked her in and turned off the light, and Sophie had lain in the dark, which for her was not different from anything else, and listened to the building breathe around her. Her mother's office was 6 floors below. Victoria Hayes worked until 10 most nights, sometimes later. Sophie knew the sound of the elevator stopping at this floor well enough to identify it by ear. 42nd floor had a slightly different hydraulic sound than the others, a small hesitation before the doors opened. She'd heard it stop and open at 11:20, which meant her mother had left late again. She'd heard her mother's heels in the corridor outside, pausing for a moment outside Sophie's door, and then continuing past. She hadn't knocked. She never knocked when she thought Sophie was asleep. Sophie had listened to her mother's footsteps fade and had thought about what Liam had said about Chopin, about being a long way from home and knowing you're not going back. She'd thought about that for a long time in the dark, turning it over, and she hadn't been able to find an angle from which it didn't apply to more than just Chopin. By the 3rd day, she was still rearranging her breakfast, and Marguerite had begun looking at her with that specific expression that meant a conversation was coming whether Sophie wanted one or not. Sophie decided she would rather initiate it than receive it. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said, at lunch, not looking up from her plate. Marguerite was quiet for a moment. "Who didn't, sweetheart?" "Liam, the man they fired. He was teaching me piano. That's all he was doing. He heard me struggling and he helped me, and then Mr. Hargrove found us and decided that because Liam cleans floors he must be She stopped. She pressed her lips together. He didn't do anything wrong, she said again. Marguerite sat down across from her. Does your mother know about this? No. Sophie. She's busy. The two words came out flat and factual, which was worse than if they'd come out with anger. Just flat and factual, a 9-year-old's accurate summary of a condition she had stopped expecting to change. She's always busy. She doesn't know about the piano room. She doesn't know about the lessons. She doesn't know... Sophie picked up her fork and put it down again. She doesn't know a lot of things. Marguerite was quiet for a long time. She had worked for this family for 5 years. She had watched Victoria Hayes build a company with the specific focused intensity of someone who had decided that success was armor and was wearing it as tight as it would go. She had watched Sophie grow up in the peripheral vision of that ambition, cared for, provided for, enrolled in good schools, given every resource, genuinely loved. She was certain of that last one. Victoria loved her daughter. She just loved her from a distance that kept widening, and from where Marguerite sat, it looked like neither of them quite knew how to close it. I'll tell your mother, Marguerite said. She should know. She won't do anything. You don't know that. Sophie looked in Marguerite's direction with an expression that was too old for her face. I've been taking piano lessons in a room on the 42nd floor for almost 2 months, she said, every night, and she didn't know. She paused. That's the whole thing, right there. Marguerite didn't have an answer for that. She made Sophie eat 3 more bites of her sandwich before letting her be excused, and then she sat at the lunch table alone after Sophie left the room and thought about what it was like to be very good at your job and have the job be the entire problem. Victoria Hayes had not built Nexogen from anything romantic. She hadn't started in a garage or dropped out of college or had a world-changing epiphany in the shower. She had worked, steadily, intelligently, without drama for 9 years, building a data infrastructure company that solved a problem most people didn't know existed until it was solved for them. And by the time the rest of the industry caught up to what she'd been doing, she was already 3 problems ahead. She was 30 years old and ran 12,000 employees and had been on the covers of 4 different business publications in the past 18 months, and she was, underneath all of that, deeply tired in a way she didn't allow herself to examine closely. Sophie's father had left when Sophie was 3. Not dramatically. There was no fight, no betrayal, no clean villain in that story. He had simply discovered, over the course of 2 years, that he was not equipped for the life Victoria was building and had been honest enough to say so before it turned into something uglier than an ending. He lived in Portland now. He called Sophie on her birthday and at Christmas and occasionally at other times, and Sophie liked him in the careful, polite way of someone managing a relationship that they understand to be important but don't quite know what to do with. Victoria did not discuss him. She did not allow herself to feel things about him that she couldn't use productively, which was a strategy she applied to several categories of emotional experience and which worked well right up until it didn't. She was in a meeting with 3 of her senior VPs when her assistant knocked and indicated there was something she needed to step out for. She excused herself, took the call in the corridor. It was Marguerite, and listened for 4 minutes without saying anything except, "Go on," once, when there was a pause that suggested Marguerite was waiting for permission to continue. When Marguerite finished, Victoria was quiet for a long moment. She's been doing this for 2 months, Victoria said. As far as I can tell, yes. Every night? After 11? Before midnight? Another silence. And this man, Liam Carter, he initiated it. He sought her out? From what Sophie says, he heard her playing and came in to help. She says he taught her things her regular teacher hadn't. Marguerite paused carefully. She says he's the reason she can play the Chopin piece now, the one she's been working on. Victoria's assistant was looking at her from a discreet distance, holding a coffee she hadn't ordered but apparently needed, which was a level of perceptiveness that Victoria genuinely valued. She took the coffee. Richard Hargrove made the call to terminate him, she said. Yes. Without consulting me. I believe so. Did he consult security? Was there any indication that anything... Sophie is very clear that nothing inappropriate happened. She was very clear about that. Marguerite's voice was careful. She said he taught her music, and that he was kind to her. Those were her words. Kind. Victoria stood in the corridor with her coffee and looked at a point on the wall in front of her that had nothing on it. Kind. Her 9-year-old blind daughter had found an after-hours piano teacher in the night maintenance staff because she was lonely and struggling, and nobody had been paying close enough attention to notice either of those things. "I'll come home early," Victoria said. "She's at school." "Tonight then. I'll be home by 7. She went back into the meeting. She sat at the head of the table and listened to her VPs discuss Q4 projections and felt, underneath the numbers, a specific unpleasant feeling that she identified, not immediately, but after a minute or two, as shame. Not guilt. Shame. They were different. Guilt was, I did something wrong. Shame was something is wrong with how I have been doing this. She had a great deal of practice managing guilt. Shame was harder. It didn't have as many handles. She was home at 6:43, which was early enough that Sophie was still at the dinner table, and looked up, oriented, adjusted, when she heard the front door. Victoria came into the dining room and put her bag on the chair inside the door and looked at her daughter eating pasta with the focused efficiency of a child who wanted to be done with dinner before anything complicated could happen. "Hi, Bug," Victoria said. "Hi." Flat. Not hostile. Sophie was rarely openly hostile. She did something more difficult, which was give you a polite surface over a deeper withdrawal. "You're home early." "I wanted to be." Victoria sat down across from her. Marguerite appeared from the kitchen with a plate that Victoria hadn't asked for and set it in front of her and retreated, which was a form of stage management that Victoria recognized and was grateful for. "I talked to Marguerite today," Sophie continued eating. "She told me about the piano room," Victoria said. Sophie set her fork down. "Are you angry?" "I'm not angry at you." Victoria watched her daughter's face. Sophie was 9, but she had always had an adult quality to her stillness, a capacity for patience in conflict that Victoria had always told herself was a sign of Sophie's strength, and was now beginning to think might also be a sign of how much practice she'd had. "I'm trying to understand what's been happening. Will you tell me about it? From the beginning?" Sophie told her. She was precise and chronological and unemotional in her delivery, which was a narrating style Victoria recognized because it was her own style, and seeing it in her daughter's face made the shame feeling get larger. Sophie described the first night, the Schumann passage, the hands-over-hands thing, the chord resolving. She described how it became regular. She described what Liam had taught her about feeling music structurally rather than technically, about emotional logic as the foundation of execution. She described the Chopin piece and what he'd said about Chopin in Poland and being somewhere that wasn't where you belong. She described the night Hargrove found them, concisely, without editorializing, and then she stopped talking. Victoria sat with all of it for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sophie looked in her direction. "When would I have told you?" The question was not rhetorical, it was genuine. And the genuine answer, which Victoria knew and Sophie knew and neither of them had to say, was that the spaces in their daily life where Sophie could have told her were narrow and inconsistent, and most of them happened after the kind of day that left Victoria visibly depleted in a way that made a 9-year-old calculate whether her thing was worth adding to the pile. "You could always tell me things," Victoria said, and heard how inadequate it was even as she said it. "I know I could," Sophie said. She picked up her fork again. "That's not really what I meant." Victoria didn't push it. She ate her dinner and they talked about other things. Sophie's school, a project Sophie was doing on echolocation in bats, which she'd chosen for reasons she didn't explain, and Victoria stayed until Sophie went to bed, which she rarely managed, and sat on the edge of Sophie's mattress in the dark and pushed the loose strand of hair back from her daughter's face and thought about all the nights she hadn't done this. Sophie wasn't asleep, they both knew that, but Sophie let her do it anyway, which felt like a form of grace being extended under condition, and Victoria received it as such. In the morning, she pulled Liam Carter's personnel file. It was thin, the way night maintenance files tended to be. Basic employment information. The termination report filed by Richard Hargrove, which was 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language that boiled down to unauthorized access and inappropriate conduct, and a previous employment section that she almost scrolled past before something in it made her stop. Before Nexogen, various day labor and maintenance positions over the past 3 years. Before that, a blank space. And then, in a different section, an entry that had been included as part of the background check and that the HR system had not known what to do with. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the file and asked her assistant to find her a current contact address for Liam Carter. She sat on it for 2 more days. She told herself she was busy, which was true. She was always busy. Q4 close was approaching, and there were 3 board members making noise about the projected infrastructure spend and a partnership negotiation that was taking longer than it should. She told herself she wanted to be careful, approach it correctly, not make assumptions. These were also true. But underneath them was something less organized, a reluctance she couldn't entirely account for, the way you sometimes hesitate before opening a door, not because you don't want what's on the other side, but because you suspect it's going to change something about the way you've been seeing things. On the 3rd day, she asked her assistant to clear her lunch hour. She found Liam Carter in a school gymnasium. She'd gotten the address from the contact information in his file. He'd listed a community center in the Riverside district as his emergency contact location, which she'd found unusual until her assistant had looked into it and reported, neutrally, that Liam Carter was listed as a volunteer music instructor at the Riverside Community Center on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. It wasn't the primary address. It wasn't where he lived. But it was where he was on a Thursday at noon, which was when Victoria Hayes arrived, unannounced, in a cashmere coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and stood in the doorway of a gymnasium that smelled of old wood and rubber, and listened to a man she had never met teach a group of 6 children, ranging from maybe 7 to 12 years old, various visible disabilities among them, how to count a rhythm by clapping. He hadn't seen her. He was facing the children, crouching down to their level, demonstrating the pattern on his own knees. He had a low voice, patient in a way that didn't sound performed. He counted with them, clapped with them, stopped one child gently when she was rushing ahead, and showed her how to find the beat in her own body first before externalizing it. Victoria stood in the doorway and watched for 4 minutes before he noticed her. He stood up when he did. He looked at her coat, at the careful blankness of her expression, at the fact that she was here, and something moved through his face that was complicated and gone quickly. He said something to the children, gestured to an older teenager sitting against the wall who appeared to be an assistant, and crossed the gymnasium toward the doorway. Up close, he was not what she'd expected. She hadn't had a clear expectation, but whatever residual image the word janitor had placed in her mind, this was not it. He was tall, well-made, with the kind of exhausted steadiness that came from holding things together for a long time on limited resources. His hands, she noticed, were rough-knuckled but long-fingered. Careful-looking hands. "Ms. Hayes," he said. Not a question. He'd known who she was the moment he saw her. "Mr. Carter." She extended her hand and he shook it briefly, without warmth or hostility, just basic courtesy. "I'd like to talk to you if you have a few minutes." He glanced back at the children. "I have about 20 before they need me back." "That's enough." They went into the corridor outside the gymnasium. It was institutional, fluorescent, with a bulletin board covered in flyers for upcoming events. Not a setting Victoria Hayes normally occupied. She stood in it without adjusting her posture, which Liam noted without commenting on. "I read your file," she said. "I wanted to apologize. What Hargrove did was his own decision, and it wasn't appropriate, and I should have been informed before any action was taken." Liam looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Is that all you have to say about it?" "What would you like me to say?" She held his gaze for a moment. He was not deferential in the way she was accustomed to from people who reported to her, but he wasn't aggressive either. He was simply level, looking at her like a person looking at another person without any particular agenda. She found it slightly disorienting. "Your file listed previous employment as a concert pianist," she said, "with the Harmon Philharmonic. Principal piano, 2 seasons. Something shifted in his face. Small, fast, gone. "That's accurate." "And before that, a performance degree from the Eastman School of Music. Graduated with distinction." "Also accurate." "And then," she paused, "and then 3 years of labor work and maintenance, and now this." She gestured toward the gymnasium, where the clapping rhythm had resumed, slightly ragged, finding itself. Liam said nothing. He wasn't going to fill in that blank, she understood. It was a closed door, and he'd decided that in advance. I'd like to understand what happened with my daughter, Victoria said, redirecting. Not the Hargrove version, yours, he told her. The version he gave was plain and undefended, no editorializing, and it tracked with what Sophie had told her closely enough that the gaps were small and explainable by perspective rather than discrepancy. He described the first night, the Schumann, the hands over hands. He described what he'd tried to teach her and why. And then, at the end, he said something that Sophie had not said. She's exceptional, he said. Not in the way people tell parents their kids are exceptional. I mean structurally. She hears music the way some people see space, as a three-dimensional thing with depth and movement and logic. Her technical foundation is solid, but what she has underneath the technique is rarer, and it's going to take her somewhere if someone shows her how to use it. He paused. I'm not her teacher anymore. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying she deserves someone who understands what she actually has. Victoria looked at him. Why did you do it? Initially, why didn't you just walk past the door? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bulletin board beside them. An announcement for a children's choir, a flyer for a CPR class. She was saying to herself, you know where D is, you know, he said, like she was trying to convince herself to trust what she knew. And I know what that sounds like. I recognize it. Victoria considered this for a moment. Because you did it yourself. Still do, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the gymnasium behind the closed door, a small voice counted a rhythm imperfectly and was gently corrected and tried again. My daughter told me that you told her that Chopin's music sounded like someone who was far from home and knew he wasn't going back, Victoria said. She's been thinking about it for days, I can tell. Liam said nothing. She also hasn't been sleeping well, Victoria said, or eating normally. She said this levelly, not accusingly, stating a fact. She misses the lessons. She misses... Victoria stopped. She looked at a point on the bulletin board. She misses having something that was hers, she said. Something that happened because of her, not because of who I am. The silence that followed this was honest in a way that Victoria didn't always allow herself. She stood in the fluorescent corridor of a community center that she'd never been in before and let it be honest. She talks about you, she said finally. Not constantly, but specifically. She talks about you the way people talk about someone who saw them clearly. Liam looked at the floor for a moment. She's easy to see, he said. She puts herself right in front of you. She does, Victoria agreed, and then, more quietly, she doesn't do that with everyone. The implication of that landed between them, and neither of them picked it up immediately. Victoria cleared her throat. I'd like to ask you something that I want you to answer honestly. Okay? Is there a reason you stopped playing professionally? Beyond the 3 years, is there something that... She measured her words. I'm not asking to pry. I'm asking because I'm trying to understand who I'm talking to. Liam looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the gymnasium door. Through it, the unsteady rhythm had become steadier. I had a daughter, he said. I have a daughter. She's 7. Her name is Lily. He said this in the careful way of someone clarifying something that's been misunderstood before. Her mother died when Lily was 4, and afterward I made choices about what mattered and what didn't, and music felt like something I didn't have the right to need anymore. Like it was a luxury that cost too much. He paused. I was wrong about that, probably. I'm still figuring that out. Victoria was quiet. She had not expected that. She was not the kind of person who became emotional easily, or at least she had trained herself not to appear to be, but something about the plainness of what he'd just said. I made choices about what mattered and what didn't. Did something to her chest. I'm sorry, she said. It was 3 years ago. That doesn't actually matter, does it? He looked at her with something new in his expression. Not quite surprise, something quieter than that. No, he said. It doesn't. She straightened. She looked at her watch. A reflex, not a genuine check of time. I'd like to offer you a position, she said. Not maintenance. I have a foundation, small, operating on the side, We fund arts education programs in underserved schools. We've been looking for a director for about 8 months, which is too long. Someone who understands music from the inside, not from a grant writing perspective. She paused. I should tell you that you're not who I was looking for when I walked in here this morning. I was looking for someone with a nonprofit management background and institutional experience. You have neither of those things. No, he said. But you have something else, she said, and I think it's more important. Liam looked at her. Something in him was cautious. She could see it. He was not a person who trusted easily, and she respected that because she wasn't either. He was running the offer through whatever system he had for assessing things, which didn't look like her system but appeared to be functional. Why are you telling me I'm not what you were looking for? He said. Most people doing this pitch wouldn't say that. Because it's true, she said, and I'd rather you come in knowing what you're getting into than feel like I sold you something. He was quiet for a long moment. Behind the door, the children had begun singing something, small voices finding a unison that kept almost collapsing and then steadying again, imperfect and determined. I have to think about it, he said. Of course. And I have a daughter, 7 years old. Whatever the hours are, they need to work around her. We'll make them work. Don't say that if you don't mean it. I don't say things I don't mean, Victoria said. It wastes time. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a decision. He looked at the gymnasium door again. Can I ask you something? Yes. Sophie, he said. Is she okay? Victoria looked at him. The question was simple and direct, and it was the first thing he'd asked her that wasn't about terms or logistics. She thought about Sophie rearranging her breakfast. Sophie saying she's always busy in that flat, accurate, devastating way. Sophie letting her smooth her hair in the dark without saying anything. She's getting there, Victoria said, which was honest. Tell her. He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment. Tell her the Debussy she was working on. The third phrase, where it goes into the triplets. She should try singing it first before she plays it. Just once. It'll unlock something. Victoria looked at him. I'll tell her. She left the community center and sat in the back of her car in the parking lot for longer than she planned to. Her assistant was quiet in the front seat, which was the correct instinct. She looked at the building. Institutional, gray, and probably full of music on a Thursday afternoon, and thought about a man who had stopped playing because he decided he didn't have the right to need it anymore, and had then spent 3 years of night shifts and Thursday afternoons quietly proving himself wrong in the smallest possible venues. She thought about Sophie at the piano at 11:30, saying to herself, you know where D is. She thought about the specific shape of that loneliness, the loneliness of a child who has figured out that she will mostly have to be her own teacher, and has decided to be a good one. She thought about herself at 30, running a company, holding everything together with both hands, sleeping 5 hours a night, and calling it sustainability. She thought about the way she'd walked past Sophie's door at 11:20 on the night Liam was fired. The pause, the continuing. She took out her phone and called Marguerite. Tell Sophie to try singing the third phrase of the Debussy before she plays it, she said when Marguerite answered. Just once through. Someone told me it'll unlock something. There was a pause. Who told you that? Someone who knows what he's talking about, Victoria said. Tell her. She put her phone away and told her driver to take her back to the office. There was a board call at 2-3 pending decisions she'd been circling for a week, a hiring announcement that needed to go out before Friday. The ordinary machinery of the life she'd built, humming along with or without her attention. She gave it her attention anyway. She was good at this, and she didn't plan to stop being good at it. But she sat in the back of the car on the way to the office and allowed herself to think clearly, for the first time in a long time, about the difference between what she was building and what she had already built, what was in the office and what was at home, and which of them would still be there in 20 years and which of them would look back at her. Meanwhile, in the third-floor apartment in the Riverside district that he'd been in for 2.5 years, Liam Carter made dinner for his daughter, pasta, because Lily had opinions about most foods and pasta was safe territory, and thought about the offer. He thought about it while he cooked. He thought about it while Lily narrated the plot of a book she was reading about a girl who trained horses, which required very little of him beyond occasional nodding. He thought about it while he did the dishes, and Lily sat on the kitchen counter watching him because she was not supposed to sit on the kitchen counter, and this was a battle he had stopped fighting. "You're thinking," Lily announced. "I'm doing dishes." "You're doing dishes and thinking. You have the face." "What face?" She pointed at him, finger extended in the direct way of the very young. "That one." He looked at her. 7 years old on the kitchen counter with her rabbit keychain pressed between her palm and the cabinet. He thought about the community center, the gymnasium, the unsteady rhythm becoming steadier behind the closed door. He thought about what he'd said to Victoria Hayes. "I made choices about what mattered and what didn't. And the way she'd said that doesn't actually matter, does it? And how she'd been right. Someone offered me a different job," he said. Lily's eyebrows went up. "At the building?" "A different one. Music. Teaching kids music." She thought about this very seriously. "Kids like the piano girl?" "Yeah, like her." "Would you be good at it?" He looked at his daughter on the kitchen counter in the lamplight of their small kitchen. He thought about Sophie placing her hands over his and reading the melody through her palms. He thought about the Chopin, the way it had changed the night Sophie understood what it was about. He thought about the third movement of the concerto he'd never finished, and whether the problem was that he'd been trying to write the ending before he knew what the resolution felt like from the inside. "Yeah," he said, "I think I would." "Then you should do it," Lily said, with the simple authority of someone for whom the logic was obvious and the hesitation was puzzling. She hopped off the counter, which she was also not supposed to do without help. "Can I have more pasta?" He gave her more pasta. He thought about the offer for the rest of the evening, and then he called Victoria Hayes's number, which she had given him on a card that he'd put in his jacket pocket, and then worried he'd lose before he was ready to decide. She answered on the second ring. "I'll take it," he said, "on the condition that the foundation works with kids like the ones at the community center, not just music students, kids who don't have access." "That's already the mandate," she said, "and the hours will make them work," she said. "I meant it." He stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and the lamplight yellow on the counter, and Lily's voice from the living room where she'd migrated with her pasta, and her book, narrating something to her elephant that he couldn't quite make out. "Okay," he said. "Good," she said. A pause. Not an uncomfortable one. "Sophie sang the third phrase," Victoria said. "Marguerite texted me. She said Sophie played it straight through after that. Didn't stop once." Liam looked at the lamplight on the counter. He thought about Sophie Bennett at the piano, her hands finding the keys with the precision of a person who had made the entire world navigable by touch, the Debussy opening up in front of her the way music opens when you finally hear what it's trying to say. "Good," he said. He said goodnight and put the phone in his pocket and stood in the kitchen of his small apartment in the Riverside district with the dishes done and his daughter reading in the next room and something in his chest that had been compressed for 3 years beginning, very slowly and without drama, to take up its proper amount of space. He went to the living room and sat beside Lily on the couch. She scooted over to make room for him without looking up from her book. The automatic adjustment of a child who knows where her father is without needing to look. He put his arm around her. She leaned into his side. Her book had a horse on the cover with a very detailed mane, and she was at a part that appeared to be tense, based on the slight furrow of her brow. "Is the horse okay?" he asked. "Shh," she said. "Important part." He was quiet. He sat with his daughter on the couch in their small apartment, and the city went on outside the window, and the lamplight was the same yellow. It was every night, and nothing about the room was different from how it had been this morning, except that something in him had shifted back into alignment, the way a door will swing correctly again after someone has fixed the hinge you didn't even know was bent. He sat with his daughter and waited for the horse to be okay. The Hayes Foundation for Music Education had an office on the 9th floor of a building 6 blocks from Nexogen headquarters, a deliberate geographic separation that Victoria had chosen without explaining her reasoning to anyone, though Liam understood it on his first day when he looked out the window and couldn't see the tower where he used to push a mop cart. Some distances were architectural decisions. The office itself was small. 4 rooms, a main workspace with 3 desks, a conference room that doubled as a storage space for instrument catalogs and grant paperwork, a narrow kitchen that always had coffee going because whoever arrived first started a pot. As a matter of course, in Liam's office, which was the smallest of the four and had a window that faced the alley, but caught afternoon light in a way that made it the best room in the building between 2 and 4 p.m., he'd put a keyboard in the corner on his third day. Not a concert instrument, a mid-range digital with weighted keys, the kind that cost what he could justify on a foundation budget and sounded about 80% as good as it should. He used it to demonstrate things to the other staff members when words weren't working. He told himself that was the reason. It had been 6 weeks since Victoria Hayes had stood in a gymnasium corridor in a cashmere coat and offered him something he hadn't known he was waiting for. 6 weeks was not long enough to call anything settled. He knew that. The job was real and the paperwork was signed, and he had a desk and a keyboard and a coffee mug with the foundation logo on it that someone had ordered without asking his preference. But the work itself was still in the stage where every day produced 3 new problems he hadn't anticipated, which was either a sign that the project was alive or a sign that he'd agreed to something too large. He hadn't determined which yet. The foundation's existing programs were modest, a partnership with 2 public schools in the district that provided after-school music instruction, a small instrument-lending library that had more violins than anything else for reasons that were historically unclear, and an annual grant to a youth choir that performed at civic events. These were functional. They were also the kind of programming that existed comfortably rather than expansively, and what Liam had been hired to do, though Victoria hadn't used those exact words, was to make them stop being comfortable. He was working on it. He'd spent the first 2 weeks reviewing everything: the existing curriculum, the instructor contracts, the student rosters, the way the lessons were structured, and why. He sat in on sessions at both schools, not as an evaluator, but as a presence in the back of the room with a notepad, watching how the children engaged and where they fell out of engagement, which was often the same moment in different rooms, the moment when the lesson became about correctness rather than about music. He wrote a 12-page report that he'd presented to Victoria in the conference room on a Tuesday morning. She'd read it while he talked, which was her style. She read faster than most people spoke and had learned to do both simultaneously without being rude about it. When he finished, she'd looked up from the last page and said, "You want to rebuild the entire curriculum?" "Yes." "That's going to create friction with the current instructors." "Some of them," he said. "The ones who are good will understand what I'm trying to do. The ones who have trouble with it will tell me things I need to know about where the resistance is." She'd looked at him for a moment. "How long?" 6 months for a working draft, a year before we'd see results in the students. "Okay," she said. "Okay. You know what you're doing. I'm not going to manage the process." She closed the report and straightened the pages against the table, a habitual neatening gesture. "That's why I hired you." He'd gone back to his office and sat at his desk and thought about that for a while. Someone trusting him entirely with something that mattered was a specific experience he'd forgotten the shape of. Now 6 weeks in, the curriculum rebuild was underway and producing exactly the friction he'd predicted. He was also, simultaneously, in the middle of 3 separate conversations with school administrators about expanding into 4 new partner schools, managing a grant application deadline that had moved up by 2 weeks without warning, and trying to figure out what to do about Marcus. Marcus Weil was 11 years old. He attended one of the Foundation's partner schools on the east side, a public middle school that was underfunded in the particular way that institutions are when they've been underfunded for long enough that it's become structural rather than situational. He had been enrolled in the Foundation's after-school music program for 8 months, assigned to keyboard instruction because the program had more keyboards than anything else, and he was, in the assessment of his instructor, a 26-year-old named Dana who was good at her job and knew what she was seeing, the most naturally gifted student she had ever taught. The problem was Marcus was about to lose his spot in the program. The program had a participation requirement. Students needed to maintain a certain attendance threshold to stay enrolled, which was a reasonable policy designed to ensure the slots went to students who were using them. Marcus had missed 11 sessions in the past 3 months. Dana had flagged it, which was the right thing to do, and the flag had come to Liam's desk with a note that said, "Per policy. Student should be notified of termination," and a question mark at the end that Dana had added because she was asking him to look at it rather than just process it. He'd looked at it. He'd talked to Dana. He'd talked to the school counselor, a tired woman named Mrs. Gaines, who had 400 students and the supply closet they'd converted into her office, and who had told him, without drama, that Marcus missed sessions because his mother worked 2 jobs, and the afternoon pickup schedule was inconsistent, and Marcus was responsible for his younger sister from 3:15 onward on the days their mother couldn't arrange coverage. Liam sat with that for a day. Then he restructured Marcus's participation agreement to allow for makeup sessions on Saturday mornings, when the foundation space was otherwise unused, and called Marcus's mother himself to explain the arrangement. The call had been brief. Marcus's mother, her name was Dana, not to be confused with Dana, a confusion that had already happened twice, had been quiet for a long moment after he explained. Then she said, "Nobody's ever done that before." "It's not a big adjustment," he said. "For you, maybe," she said. "Not for us." He hadn't known what to say to that, so he said he'd see Marcus on Saturday, and he had, and Marcus had shown up 20 minutes early and played for 2.5 hours with the focused intensity of someone who had been given something they'd been afraid was going to be taken away and was not going to waste a minute of it. That had been 2 weeks ago. Marcus came every Saturday now. He was working through a jazz theory program that Liam had put together informally. Nothing official, just a set of recordings and concepts and exercises that he gave to Marcus week by week, watching what stuck and what didn't. Marcus had perfect pitch, which he hadn't known was unusual, which itself was somehow both heartbreaking and clarifying. He'd assumed everyone heard music the way he heard it. He was 11 years old and had been carrying this rare instrument in his chest his entire life without knowing it was rare. Liam thought about that a lot. How many Marcuses there were. How many Sophie Bennetts, for that matter? How many children with something extraordinary in them, sitting in underfunded rooms with inconsistent pickup schedules and braid that had mostly fallen apart, working through the same 4 bars for 6 days because nobody had shown them where D actually was. This was the thing that kept him at his desk until 7 most evenings, which Lily had registered and commented on in the particular way she had of commenting on things she disapproved of. Not directly, but by being asleep when he arrived home and then awake at 6 a.m. with an expression that suggested she'd been thinking about it. "You were late again," she said on a Wednesday morning, not looking up from her cereal. "I know, I'm sorry." Mrs. Okafor watched me. "I know," I texted her. "She let me watch TV until 9. "That's between you and Mrs. Okafor." Lily finally looked up. She had her mother's eyes. He thought about that often. The way certain things persisted regardless of what you did or didn't do, the genetics of a person you'd loved carrying forward in the face of the child you were raising alone. "Are you happy?" she asked. Same question she'd asked a month ago. She was checking. "Yeah," he said. "I am. It's a lot of work and I keep finding more to do." "Is that bad?" "No," he said. "Actually, no, I don't think it is." She considered him for a moment with those evaluating eyes. "Okay," she said, and returned to her cereal, which was her version of provisional acceptance. He was also, peripherally, still aware of Richard Hargrove. He hadn't seen the man since the night in the music room. Hargrove was still at Nexogen, still a senior VP, still occupying the same office on the 42nd floor. And this was something Liam knew, because Sophie had mentioned it, not bitterly, but factually, in the way she mentioned most things. The firing had generated no formal review, no inquiry. The termination report remained in the system as written. This was a reality that sat at the back of Liam's awareness in the way that unresolved things do. Not consuming his attention, but present. The way a sound you can't identify persists under other sounds, until you either find the source or stop being in the building. He had not discussed this with Victoria. It was not his place to discuss it. He'd been hired to run a foundation, and he ran the foundation, and what happened in the executive floors of Nexogen was a separate country with its own weather. He saw Victoria regularly now, in a professional capacity, weekly check-ins that were efficient and substantive and occasionally ran long when they got into the details of curriculum design, which was the area where they agreed most completely and also disagreed most productively. She asked good questions. She challenged assumptions without being combative, which was a skill that looked easy and wasn't. She had a way of identifying the weakest point in an argument by going quiet for a moment and then asking one question, and the question was always the exact right one. He respected her. More than he'd expected to, which he was self-aware enough to recognize as having been conditioned by his initial image of the situation, the CEO, the executive floor, the firing, and corrected by actual contact. What he hadn't done, in 6 weeks, was see Sophie. This was by unspoken design. Victoria had not suggested a meeting, and he had not requested one, and the logic of this was clear to both of them, without being stated. The situation was new, the professional relationship was still finding its shape, and inserting Sophie into the middle of it before anything had settled was the kind of thing that could complicate everything. He understood this. It was the right call. He thought about Sophie anyway. He thought about her the way you think about a piece of music you've been working on and set aside. Not constantly, but when something related surfaces. He wondered if she'd kept working on the Debussy. He wondered if she'd found a new teacher yet, and if the teacher understood what they had in front of them. He hoped so. He thought it was likely that they didn't, and this was a thought he set down each time he picked it up because it wasn't his territory anymore. On a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of January, 6.5 weeks into the job, he was at his desk trying to finalize the language on the new partner school agreement when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Victoria Hayes. He answered. "Are you in the office?" she said. "Yes. I'm coming over. 20 minutes. A pause, which was unusual. She didn't usually pause. "It's not about work." She arrived in 18 minutes, which was the rate at which Victoria moved when she was determined, and she was in his office before he'd fully processed the call. She was wearing the same kind of coat she'd had at the community center. Different color, same quality, same deliberate armor of it. And she sat in the chair across from his desk and crossed her arms and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. "Sophie has been asking about you," she said. "Okay. Every few days, not constantly, but she asks if I've talked to you, if you're doing well, whether—" She stopped. She uncrossed and recrossed her arms. "She's gotten very good at the Debussy," she said. "She played it for me 2 weeks ago. I sat in the living room and she played it and I—" Another stop. Victoria Hayes was someone who chose her words with precision, and the pauses were not hesitation, but editing. "It was the first time I'd really heard her play," she said. "Not heard her practicing in another room, really listened, sat down and gave her my full attention." Liam waited. "It was extraordinary," Victoria said, "and I sat there and I thought about how many times I'd walked past that room and heard music and kept walking and just—" Her jaw tightened briefly. "She's been doing this for years, working on something extraordinary in a room by herself while I kept walking past." He didn't say anything. There wasn't a response that improved on the silence. "I'm not asking for absolution," she said, which told him she'd clocked his silence correctly. "I'm telling you because it's relevant to what I want to discuss." She straightened. Back to the mode he knew. Efficient, forward-moving. Her piano teacher, the formal one. He retired in December. We've been interviewing replacements, and she hates all of them. "How many?" 3. The first one she said was teaching her to play notes, not music. The second one she said corrected her fingering 12 times in 40 minutes and never mentioned the piece itself. The third one, Victoria's expression did something dry. The third one apparently told her that blind pianists had a particular challenge with expressive playing due to limited visual cues from other performers. And Sophie told him that she'd never needed visual cues to know what she was doing and asked him to leave. Despite himself, Liam almost smiled. "That sounds like her." "She's 9, Victoria said. "She sent a teacher away." "She's right, though. Blind musicians aren't lacking anything. They're processing differently." "I know she's right. That's not the point." Victoria looked at him directly. "She's asked if you could teach her again, not in the same situation, not secretly, not after hours. Formally. She wants formal lessons with you." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone in the office down the hall was on a call that was clearly going sideways, the tone of their voice shifting into the careful neutral of damage control. Liam looked at his keyboard in the corner. The afternoon light was on it. "I'm not a private piano instructor," he said. "I know what you are. I'm asking if you'd consider it. A few hours a week, separate from the foundation work, structured properly, compensated properly." She paused. She's 9 years old and she fired her last teacher because he didn't understand what he had. I'd like her to have someone who does. He looked at the keyboard. He thought about the Debussy opening up after Sophie sang the third phrase through once. He thought about what he'd told Dana about the moment children fell out of engagement. The same moment in different rooms, always when the lesson became about correctness rather than about music. Would she know ahead of time? He said. If I agree, I don't want her to be surprised. I don't want it to feel like I just turned up and things went back to how they were. I'll tell her tonight and let her decide. If she says no, that's the answer. Of course. And if she says yes, he paused. No after-hours anything, proper schedule, proper space. The foundation has a room with a piano, Victoria said. You put one in last month. I know. I'm saying it should be set up right. It will be. He looked at her. She looked back at him. There was something in her face that wasn't quite the professional expression she wore in their work meetings. Something more personal and more careful, like she was asking him for something she wasn't accustomed to asking anyone for. Which, he understood, she was. Okay, he said. She left 20 minutes later. He sat at his desk for a while and didn't work on the partner school agreement. He looked at the keyboard. He thought about the Kinderszenen passage, E flat to D, not a step but a stretch, and how it felt when the chord resolved after 6 days of not resolving. His phone buzzed at 7:45 that evening. A text from Victoria. 2 words. She said yes. He put his phone down and looked at Lily across the kitchen table, who was eating her dinner and reading simultaneously, which he'd given up prohibiting. He thought about telling her. He thought about waiting until it was more established and then telling her. He thought about how much energy it cost to protect 7-year-olds from things that would probably make them happy. I'm going to start teaching piano again, he said. To a student. A specific student, a kid I was teaching before. Lily looked up from her book. The piano girl? Yeah. She thought about this for a moment. Does she know you're going to teach her again? I just found out she said yes. Did you know she was going to say yes? He considered. I hoped. Lily nodded slowly. You should get her something, she said. For being a good student, Mrs. Perino gives us stickers. She's 9, not 5. Stickers are good at every age, Dad. She went back to her book, case closed. The first lesson was the following Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. The foundation's room with the piano that was slightly better than the digital keyboard in his office, but not as good as the Yamaha on the 42nd floor. He arrived early and set up the music stand and found he was doing the thing he did when he was nervous, which was straightening things that didn't need straightening. Victoria brought Sophie at 5 minutes to 10. She knocked on the open door and Sophie came in first, navigating the room with her left hand trailing slightly, cataloging the space. The piano's location established by its bulk and the smell of instrument polish, the music stand beside it, the chairs, the window. She was dressed in regular clothes, not her school uniform, which somehow made her look younger and more like herself simultaneously. She stopped near the piano. It's not as nice as the one upstairs, she said. No, Liam agreed, but it's real. It is. She was quiet for a moment. Then, are you going to teach me the same way or differently, because this is official now? Same way, he said. Maybe more systematically since we have more time, but the same way. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Okay, she said. Then, I'm glad you came back. He thought about several things he could say to this. He picked the simplest one. Me too, he said. Victoria stayed for the first 10 minutes, sitting in the chair by the door with a folder open on her lap that she wasn't really reading. Then she put the folder down, watched her daughter and Liam work through the opening of the Debussy. Sophie demonstrating what she'd built in the weeks since he'd last heard her, Liam listening carefully, nodding at certain moments and making a small sound at others that meant yes, keep going. And she stood up quietly and left the room and closed the door behind her. She stood in the hallway outside the closed door for a moment. Through it, she could hear the piano, and Sophie's voice asking a question, and Liam's voice answering, and then the piano again, the Debussy, different this time, something added, something extended, the music finding a phrase it hadn't found before. She stood and listened to this for longer than she planned to. Then she went down to the lobby and found a coffee shop 2 blocks away and sat at a table by the window and looked at her phone without using it and tried to identify the specific quality of the feeling in her chest, which was unfamiliar enough that it took her a while to place. It was something close to relief. Not the relief of a problem solved. She was experienced enough with problem solving to know that this was not a solved situation, that it was a beginning with all the uncertainty that beginnings carried. Something more like the relief of having stopped moving in the wrong direction, of reorientation, the feeling of a compass needle that has been spinning, finding north. She sat with it and let it be what it was. Meanwhile, in the music room 3 floors up, the lesson had moved past the Debussy into new territory. Liam had introduced a Bach invention, 2-part, designed to develop independence between the hands, which was a technical goal, but which also had an architecture that Sophie would respond to once she heard it structurally. He played it through once at full tempo, then broken down. Sophie listened in that total body way she had. When he finished, she said, "The 2 voices are arguing." "Not exactly arguing," he said, more like arguing, she said again, more certain. "But they agree at the end." He stopped. "Yeah," he said. "Actually, yeah. That's it." She found the opening position on the keys. "Can you show me the right hand first?" He showed her the right hand. She played it back. He showed her the left. She played it back. These were the building blocks. And what he was watching, which was what he was always watching in the foundation classes, with Marcus on Saturday mornings, with Sophie now, was the moment when the technical information became musical understanding. It happened at different speeds in different students, and in some it barely happened at all, regardless of how you taught. In Sophie it happened fast, and then it went deep, the way water in certain landscapes disappears underground and then reappears somewhere else entirely, enriched by whatever it passed through. She played both hands separately 3 times each and then said, "Can I try them together?" "You don't have to rush it." "I know," she said, "but I think I have it." She did. Not perfectly. The independence wasn't there yet, the left hand following the right slightly too closely in a few spots, but the intention was correct. The architecture was understood. The 2 voices argued and agreed at the end, and Sophie Bennett heard them doing it, and it showed in her hands. After the lesson, Victoria came back up, and they stood in the hallway for a few minutes while Sophie used the restroom, a detail so ordinary that it briefly and unexpectedly moved Liam, the plainness of it, the way an ordinary Saturday morning had assembled itself out of what had seemed 3 months ago like wreckage. "How'd she do?" Victoria asked. "She told me the Bach voices were arguing, but they agreed at the end," he said. Victoria looked at him. "Is that right?" "That's more or less a musicologically accurate description of contrapuntal tension and resolution in the Baroque style, yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "She's 9, she said again, but differently than before. "She is," he said, "and she's going to be something." Victoria nodded slowly, and there was something in the nod that he hadn't seen in her before. Not the efficient acknowledgement of a decision-maker, but the quieter, less armored thing of a mother hearing something true about her child and letting herself fully receive it. Sophie came back down the hallway, navigating without her hand on the wall this time. She'd mapped the space in the course of the morning and didn't need it anymore. She was wearing her jacket and pulling her gloves on, and she stopped when she was close to them by sound and orientation. "Same time next week?" she asked Liam. "Same time next week," he said. "I'm going to practice the Bach every day," she said. "So the hands are more independent." "Good. And record yourself if Marguerite has a way to do that. I want you to listen back and tell me what you hear that I didn't ask you to hear." She considered this. "What does that mean?" "It means listen to your own playing the way you listen to mine when you put your hands on top of mine," he said. "What does your playing tell you about what you don't know yet?" Sophie turned this over in her mind visibly, her face moving through concentration and then a kind of curiosity. "Okay," she said, "I'll try." They left and Liam locked up the room and went back to his office to finish the partner school agreement that he hadn't finished yesterday. He sat at his desk and opened the document, and the afternoon light was on the keyboard in the corner. He worked for 2 hours without stopping, which was unusual for him on a Saturday, But the words were coming clearly, and the structure of the agreement made sense in a way that it hadn't yesterday, and he didn't question the reason for that. At 3 in the afternoon, his cell rang. He glanced at the screen and didn't recognize the number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he picked up. "Mr. Carter." The voice was male, older, measured in the particular controlled way of someone who is choosing their register deliberately. "My name is James Whitfield. I'm on the board of the Harmon Philharmonic." Liam's hand tightened slightly on the phone. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 3 years. The Harmon Philharmonic. Principal piano, 2 seasons, the position he'd left without finishing, the life he'd folded and put away in a box he didn't open. "I'm aware of who you are," Liam said. "We've been following your work with the Hayes Foundation," Whitfield said. "The curriculum proposal that's been circulating in arts education circles." A pause. "And we've been told you've started composing again." Liam looked at the keyboard. He hadn't told anyone he was composing again. He told himself it was just working through old material, not composing. The distinction had always been somewhat artificial, and he knew it. "Where did you hear that?" he said. "That's not important," Whitfield said. "What's important is that we're planning a benefit concert in April. For arts education funding, there's overlap with your work, which is why the conversation came to us naturally. We're looking for a program anchor, something original." Another pause. "We'd like you to consider performing. And if there's original work, something you've been developing, we'd like to consider programming it." The room was very quiet. The afternoon light on the keyboard was the same light it had been all afternoon, the same room, the same ordinary Saturday, and yet something in the air had shifted in the way air shifts in certain moments, when the future makes a small sound before it fully arrives. "I don't have anything finished," Liam said. "The concert is in April," Whitfield said. "That's 3 months. I know when April is. The third movement is the difficulty, I'd imagine." The voice was calm, no urgency in it, just the flat certainty of someone who had done his research. Third movements often are, but sometimes they need the right context before they'll resolve. Liam sat with the phone against his ear and looked at his keyboard and thought about the concerto, the first movement that had always worked, the second that had come together in pieces, and the third that had resisted him for 2 years because he hadn't known what it was trying to say or where it needed to land. He thought about what he'd said to Victoria in the community center corridor. "I made choices about what mattered and what didn't." He thought about Lily patting his hand twice on the morning after the firing, the small, serious gravity of it. He thought about Sophie's hands over his, reading the melody through her palms. He thought about the chord resolving after 6 days of not resolving. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Whitfield said. After the call, Liam sat for a long time. The afternoon light moved off the keyboard as the sun shifted, and the room went to its regular light, and he sat in it and turned the conversation over in his mind. 3 months. A benefit concert. Original work. He pulled up a blank document on his laptop and put it beside his keyboard and looked at both of them. He placed his hands on the keys. He didn't play anything for a while. He sat in the ordinary Saturday afternoon quiet of a small office in a building 6 blocks from a company where he used to push a mop cart and thought about the third movement, what it was resisting, what it needed, what resolution felt like from the inside when you'd finally earned it. He started to play. It wasn't finished. It wasn't even close to finished, but it moved in a direction that felt right in a way the third movement had never felt right before, like it had found something to build toward. Not a triumphant conclusion, nothing as simple as that, but a kind of honest arriving. The music went somewhere specific, and it was somewhere he recognized, somewhere that had to do with a gymnasium in the Riverside district and a small kitchen with yellow lamplight and a horse being okay and a chord that had been waiting 6 days to resolve, and finally did. He played until he heard his phone buzz on the desk. He stopped and looked at it. A text from Lily. "Mrs. Okafor says dinner is ready if you want to come home." He looked at the draft open on his laptop. 8 measures of the third movement, rough and real, the beginning of something that knew where it was going. He saved the file. He put on his coat. He turned off the afternoon light and locked the office and went home to his daughter, and the city was ordinary outside the windows of the car, and it was a Saturday, and somewhere in an apartment 6 floors above Nexigen headquarters, a 9-year-old girl was at her bedroom piano practicing a Bach invention, with her hands getting more independent measure by measure. The two voices learning to stop following each other, learning to be separate and whole and in conversation at the same time. He didn't know yet what April would bring. He didn't know if the third movement would resolve into something he could offer to an audience, or if it would stay unfinished the way some things stayed unfinished, the way life didn't always give you the ending the structure seemed to be reaching toward. He didn't know if the partnership schools would all come through, or if the curriculum rebuild would work the way he believed it would, or if Marcus would still be playing piano at 16 or 25. He didn't know most things about most of what was ahead, but he knew the third movement had moved tonight. 8 measures, rough and real, and that was more than it had been this morning. He went home to his daughter and ate dinner and heard about the horse, which was going to be okay, and the lamplight was yellow on the kitchen counter, and somewhere below the level of ordinary Saturday evening things, something in him was still playing. The third movement came in pieces, the way things do when they've been resisting you long enough that the resistance itself becomes part of the structure. Liam worked on it in the early mornings, before Lily woke up, sitting at the kitchen table with headphones and a notation program on his laptop, because the keyboard in the corner of his office was a 15-minute drive away, and the mornings were short, and the ideas, when they came fast and needed to be caught before the day absorbed them. He'd written music this way before, not the concerto, which had always been a slower, more deliberate project, but smaller things, pieces that arrived almost complete and just needed to be written down. The third movement was not arriving complete. It was arriving in 8-measure installments, each one requiring him to sit with it for a day or two before the next section would come, like the music was testing whether he was paying attention before it gave him the next part. This was not comfortable. He was, by the end of the second week of February, operating on 5 hours of sleep on a good night and 4 on a bad one, managing the foundation work during the day, teaching Sophie on Saturday mornings, running Marcus through jazz theory on Saturday afternoons, and spending his evenings reading whatever Sophie had been working on during the week, because she sent him voice memos now, recordings of herself practicing, exactly as he'd asked. And they were detailed and serious and required a real response, not a general one. He was not complaining about any of this. That was the strange thing. He was tired in a way that had texture and direction, tired the way you are when the tiredness comes from doing things that matter, which was a different animal entirely from the tiredness of pushing a mop cart down a hallway at 2 a.m. with earbuds in blocking out the sound of a building that didn't know you were there. The distinction mattered. He thought about it sometimes while he was writing, the way you think about the absence of pain after a long time of having it, the simple fact of no longer feeling the specific weight of a life that was wrong for you. He was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning in late February when his phone rang at 7:15, which was early enough that he picked it up without checking the screen, assuming it was Lily's school. It was Victoria. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not over the phone. Can you come in early today?" Her voice was different, not the efficient forward-moving register she used for work calls, something underneath it that he identified after a moment as controlled anger. The specific flatness of someone who has made a decision about how they're going to handle something and is holding themselves to it by concentration. "I can be there at 8:30, he said. "Good." She paused. "I'm sorry for the early call." "It's fine. What's happening?" "I'll tell you when you're here." He dropped Lily at school and drove to Nexigen headquarters, which he hadn't been inside since the night his badge was taken. The security desk in the lobby was different now. New guard, different configuration, a minor renovation to the entrance that hadn't been there before. He signed in as a visitor, which was its own kind of information, and rode the elevator to the 44th floor, which was the CEO's floor and not the 42nd, which was deliberate, which told him something. Victoria's office was large in the way executive offices are large, not ostentatiously, but functionally, with enough space that a meeting of 10 people was comfortable and a meeting of 2 felt like a conversation rather than an interrogation. She was standing at the window when he came in, looking out at the city, and she turned when she heard him enter, and her expression confirmed what her voice had suggested on the phone. "Sit down," she said. Then, before he could, "Actually, I need to stand. You can sit if you want." He sat. She stayed at the window, arms crossed, looking at him with the expression of someone who has been thinking about a problem for long enough that the thinking has become physical. "Richard Hargrove," she said. Liam waited. "He's been running a parallel narrative," she said, "about why you were terminated, about what he believed he saw in that room." She said the last sentence with a precision that indicated she was choosing the words carefully to stay accurate. "I found out this morning because someone on the executive team came to me directly. Someone who has been uncomfortable for a while and decided, after seeing the Foundation's recent curriculum proposal circulating in the building, that she needed to tell me what's been circulating at the same time." "What's he been saying?" Liam asked. Victoria looked at him. "That his concerns were valid, that the termination was the correct call, that my decision to hire you through the Foundation was a lapse in judgment driven by Sophie's emotional attachment to you." She paused. "And that the fact that I've subsequently allowed you to privately tutor my daughter represents a conflict of interest that the board should be aware of." The room was quiet for a moment. Liam looked at the window behind her, at the city going about its Tuesday morning, indifferent and ordinary. "Has he gone to the board?" he said. "He's raised it informally with 2 board members," she said, "which in practice means he's built a small fire and is waiting to see if it catches." "And will it?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "The board they're not irrational people, but they're cautious people. And the narrative Hargrove is running is constructed carefully enough that it doesn't require them to believe the worst. It only requires them to be uncertain enough to ask questions." She uncrossed her arms. "Which is a much lower threshold." Liam thought about this. He thought about the termination report in his file. 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language that had never been reviewed or amended. He thought about the word inappropriate sitting there in the system, uncontested, available to anyone who wanted to build something on it. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like a recalibration. He suspected she'd expected a different question, possibly a more defensive one. "I want to make the truth the loudest thing in the room," she said, "which means being direct with the board about what actually happened, what my decision-making process was, and why the Foundation's work speaks for itself." She paused. "But I want to know what you want to do. This affects you more than it affects me. You're the one whose record has something in it that shouldn't be there." Liam looked at her. He thought about several responses. He picked the honest one. "I want it corrected," he said. "I don't need Hargrove to apologize to me. I don't need it to be a public thing. But the termination report says what it says, and it's wrong, and it should say something different." Victoria nodded once. "I'll have legal pull the file today. We'll issue a corrected record and a formal statement of wrongful termination." She said this like it was a reasonable administrative task, and not the thing it actually was, which was an acknowledgement that a man's reputation had been damaged by a decision made in under 2 minutes on the basis of a uniform and nothing else. "The board?" he said. "I'll handle the board." She said this with the specific calm of someone who had handled boards before and was not worried about this one. "There's a meeting Friday. I'll address it directly." "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked at him. "Of course I do. I mean, it's your company. You don't owe me a board meeting." "Liam." She said his name in a way that wasn't quite impatient, but was in the neighborhood. "You didn't do anything wrong. You sat down beside a lonely child who was struggling with a piece of music and you helped her. That's what happened. If I let a version of events stand that says something different, I'm managing a story. I'm not interested in managing a story." She picked up a folder from her desk, glanced at it, put it back down. "I'm interested in it being correct." He looked at her for a moment. There was something he wanted to say that wasn't quite professional territory, something about the difference between people who were fair and people who were just, and how he'd spent most of the past 3 years assuming that the categories rarely overlapped. He didn't say it. He filed it in the place where things go when they're true and not yet speakable. "Okay," he said. "There's something else," she said. She walked to her desk and sat down, which was a shift. She'd been standing the whole time, which he now understood was a physical management of her own emotional state, and sitting down was a signal that the next thing was different. "The board meeting is Friday. Hargrove will be there, which he always is. And when I address this directly, I want the Foundation's work to be part of what I'm presenting. Not defensively. I don't want it to look like I'm justifying my decisions through outcomes, which is a logical trap. But the work is real, and it should be seen. She looked at him. I want you to come. To the board meeting. Yes. You want me to present the foundation work to the board of directors of Nexogen Technologies? Yes. He thought about this. I've never done a board presentation. I know. I'll help you prepare. Victoria, you know the work better than anyone, she said. Better than me, better than our communications person, better than anyone who could stand up there. The board doesn't need a polished presentation. They need to see someone who understands what they're doing and why it matters. She paused. You're that person. He sat with it. He thought about Marcus arriving 20 minutes early on Saturdays. He thought about the 12-page curriculum report that Victoria had read while he talked. He thought about Mrs. Gaines in her converted supply closet with 400 students and the careful, exhausted precision with which she'd described Marcus's situation. How long do I have to present? He said. 10 minutes. I can do it in 8. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile. Something quieter and more real than a smile. I know you can, she said. They spent 3 hours that afternoon preparing, not rehearsing, exactly. Liam was not the kind of person who benefited from scripted rehearsal, and Victoria seemed to understand this without him saying it. Instead, they went through the foundation's work systematically, with Victoria asking the questions she expected the board to ask, and Liam answering them, and Victoria occasionally stopping him to say, that answer is accurate but too long, or that's the right instinct, but you buried the important part, and him going back and trying again until they both felt it was right. It was a strange afternoon, functional and focused, and also somehow more honest than most of his conversations with most people, including people he'd known considerably longer. At one point she said, "Tell me about Marcus." He told her about Marcus. Not the institutional version, the enrollment data and the attendance remediation and the Saturday program. The real version, Marcus at the keyboard, perfect pitch he'd assumed was universal, the jazz theory program, the way he played as if the music was something he'd been keeping alive inside him for years and was only now being given the conditions to let out. Victoria listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He's not in the board presentation, she said. No, too personal. I don't have his mother's permission to use him as an example in that context. Good call. She made a note. But tell me that story somewhere it can be heard. A grant application, a donor letter, something. I will, he said, when the time is right. She looked at him. The time is usually before you think it is.
Ja, Mom.
On Friday morning, he put on the best clothes he owned, which were good clothes. He'd bought them for a concert 2 seasons ago, and they still fit and still worked, and this was not lost on him, the way certain things persist in your closet as evidence of a life that hasn't entirely ended. He drove Lily to school early because he needed to be at Nexogen by 8, and her school didn't open until 8:15 and Mrs. Okafor was covering, which Lily accepted with the equanimity of someone who had learned that flexibility was part of the condition of her particular life. At the door of the school, Lily turned back. How do you look? She asked. She was 7 and blind to subtext in most situations, but entirely accurate about emotional weather. I don't know, he said. Good, I think. You look like you when you're trying, she said, which was not a criticism, he understood. It was an observation. She went inside. The Nexogen boardroom was on the 45th floor, one above Victoria's office, with a view of the city that was impressive in the automatic, indifferent way of impressive views. They were there whether you looked or not. The board was 8 people, seated around a long table, with the various specific types of attention that board members give. Some engaged, some evaluating, some already somewhere else. Richard Hargrove was at the far end. Liam saw him before Hargrove saw him, and used the 2 seconds to look at him plainly and without the overlay of the night in the music room that his memory kept wanting to apply. Hargrove was in his mid-50s, measured, the kind of man who had learned to weaponize composure, He saw Liam, and something moved through his face that was too controlled to name, but was real and visible for the fraction of a second before the composure covered it. Victoria opened the meeting. She was efficient and clear and moved through the agenda in the way of someone who runs these meetings regularly and has stopped being deferential in them, which was its own kind of interesting to watch. When she got to the foundation item, she introduced Liam without embellishment, his background, his role, what he'd been doing. She didn't editorialize. She let the facts be the argument, which was her style. Liam stood up. He'd decided not to use slides. He'd prepared them. A clean presentation, enrollment numbers, curriculum overview, the new partner school agreements. But standing in the elevator on the way up, he decided against it. Slides gave people somewhere to look that wasn't at you, and what he wanted was for them to look at him, because what he was about to say needed to be heard from a person, not read off a screen. He spoke for 7.5 minutes. He described what the foundation had been doing and what he'd changed and why. He described the gap, not in abstract policy terms, but in specific grounded terms, the way the gap actually felt from the inside when you were sitting in the back of a classroom watching children fall out of engagement at the exact same moment. He described what he believed the solution was and what the evidence, small and early, suggested about whether it was working. He did not mention Sophie. He did not mention the night in the music room. He did not say anything that was not strictly about the work. When he finished, one of the board members, a woman in her 60s named Adler, who had the alert, skeptical attention of someone who had heard a lot of presentations and filtered most of them, asked 2 questions. Both were precise. He answered them precisely. She nodded once and wrote something. Another board member asked about the expansion timeline. He answered. Another asked about the curriculum licensing model. He answered. Hargrove asked nothing. He sat down. Victoria continued the meeting. At the end of the foundation discussion, she said, "I want to address something that's been raised informally in the past few weeks about my relationship with the foundation and its director." She said it without preamble, without padding, in the same tone she used for everything else. "I've asked legal to correct the termination record from November. The original record was filed without my knowledge or approval and does not accurately reflect the circumstances. The foundation's work stands on its own merits, which the board has now seen firsthand, and I'd ask that any questions about the leadership structure come to me directly rather than circulating informally." She moved on to the next agenda item. Hargrove said nothing. His composure was intact, but something about it was effortful now in a way it hadn't been at the beginning of the meeting, and this was visible to Liam in the way that certain things are visible when you've learned to look for them. After the meeting, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Adler stopped him. "The curriculum proposal you mentioned," she said, "the structural one. I'd like to read it." "I can send it to you today." She handed him a card. "Do that." She looked at him for a moment. "My granddaughter is blind from birth. She's 4. We've been looking for—" She stopped. She looked at the card he was still holding. "Send me the proposal," she said, "and include whatever you have on early music education for children with visual impairment." He looked at her. "I'll put it together myself," he said, specifically. She nodded and left. He stood in the corridor for a moment with her card in his hand and thought about the way things connect when you stop expecting them to and just do the work. Victoria appeared beside him. "Adler," she said, "her granddaughter." "I know." She paused. "I didn't arrange that." "I know you didn't." She looked at him. "How are you?" It was a simple question and not a work question, and the shift in register was deliberate and visible. He thought about it honestly before answering. "Better than I expected to be," he said, "considering I was in that room 6 hours ago." "Hargrove isn't going to say anything further," she said. "I'm confident of that." "Because of this morning?" "Because of the record correction, and because 2 of those board members are more interested in the foundation's work than in whatever narrative he'd constructed." She paused. "And because he's not stupid enough to push something that's already collapsed under its own weight." Liam thought about this. He thought about the termination report, the corrected version that would replace it, the language that would now say what actually happened instead of what Hargrove's 2-minute judgment had decided. A document, a correction. Not nothing. Not everything, but not nothing. "Thank you," he said. For the board meeting. For this morning. For... He stopped, because the list was getting long and specific and personal in a way that the corridor outside a boardroom wasn't quite the right venue for. Victoria looked at him. She had the composed expression she usually wore, but there was something around the edges of it that was less composed, something that looked like it was making a decision about itself. "Don't thank me," she said. "You did the work. I corrected a wrong. Those are different categories. They're both worth acknowledging." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Sophie learned the second Bach invention this week. She sent me a recording. I listened to it 3 times on Tuesday evening instead of reading the brief I was supposed to read." He looked at her. "How was it?" "The voices don't follow each other anymore," she said. "They're independent." He held that for a moment. "Good," he said. She nodded and said she had a call in 10 minutes and walked back toward her office, efficient and directed. And he watched her go and thought about the 3 months since a music room door had been cracked open in a building where he pushed a mop cart, and all the things that had moved in those months, slowly, imperfectly, without plan, the way actual things move. He went back to his office and sent the curriculum proposal to Adler with a 3-page addendum he wrote in 45 minutes on early music education for blind children, drawing on everything he'd developed with Sophie and everything he'd been reading since, and at the bottom he included his direct number and said to call anytime. Then he got to the rest of the day's work, which was considerable. That Saturday, he told Sophie that the record had been corrected. He told her plainly, before the lesson started, because he thought she deserved to know, and he thought she was old enough to understand what it meant. She sat at the piano with her hands in her lap and listened to him explain it, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Did Mr. Hargrove get in trouble?" she asked. "That's not my call," he said. "But did he?" "He's still at the company," Liam said. "Some things get corrected formally. Other things, you just have to live with knowing what happened and who did what." Sophie thought about this. "That doesn't seem right." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She was quiet for another moment, then, "My mom did something about it, though." "She did." Sophie's face did something complicated and quiet that he didn't try to interpret. She turned toward the keys. "Can we work on the Chopin today? The Nocturne? I've been thinking about what you said about Chopin and Poland, and I think I understand something different now than I understood before." "Show me," he said. She played the Nocturne. It was different from the last time he'd heard her play it. Measurably, specifically different, in the way that understanding changes performance in ways that have nothing to do with technique. The same notes, the same tempo, the same hands on the same keys, but the underneath of it was altered. Something in the left hand's patience with the right, the way it held steady while the melody searched, the way it didn't rush resolution, had the quality of someone who had recently learned something true and had found it in the music before they found it in words. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. "What do you hear that's different?" he asked. "The left hand knows it's not going home," she said. "Before I was playing it like maybe it would get to go home at the end. Now I think it knows from the beginning, and it's okay anyway. It keeps playing anyway." The room was very quiet. The afternoon light was on the piano. "Yeah," Liam said. His voice was level. "That's it. That's exactly it." She played it again. He listened. He thought about the concerto's third movement, 22 measures now, rough and real and moving in the right direction, and what it was reaching toward. He thought about what Sophie had just said. It knows from the beginning. And it's okay anyway. It keeps playing anyway. After the lesson, Victoria picked Sophie up, which she'd been doing for the past 2 Saturdays. Arriving 10 minutes early, sitting in the hallway on the bench outside the music room, reading on her phone with the kind of focused distraction of someone who is trying not to listen and listening anyway. This time, when Sophie came out, Victoria stood and helped her with her jacket, and Sophie let her, which was not always the case. Sophie had strong opinions about assistance she hadn't requested and wasn't shy about expressing them. But she let her mother button the top button that she'd missed, and Victoria did it without making it a moment, just the practical gesture of a parent who is paying attention, and Sophie moved on down the hall without comment. Liam watched this from the doorway of the music room. Victoria glanced back at him. She looked like she was going to say something, something that wasn't work, wasn't the board, wasn't the curriculum. She held it for a moment. Then she said, "See you Wednesday," which was their next scheduled check-in, and walked down the hall with her daughter. He watched them go. Sophie's hand found her mother's arm partway down the corridor. Not requesting guidance, just making contact, the absent habitual touch of someone who knows where they are and simply wants to be connected to someone. Victoria's hand came up and covered Sophie's without breaking stride. He stood in the doorway and watched them turn the corner. Then he went back inside and sat at the piano for a while. Not to practice, not to work on the concerto, just to sit with his hands on the keys and let the afternoon be what it was. He played the opening of the third movement, the 22 measures that existed. He played them slowly, feeling where they were trying to go, what the resolution needed to be. And this time, for the first time, he could hear the ending, not completely, not with the full detail of a finished thing, but as a shape in the distance, the way you can sometimes see the outline of something through fog before you can make out its features. The movement knew it wasn't going home either, but it kept playing anyway. And in the keeping playing, in the decision to go on without the guarantee of arrival, there was something that was not loss and not triumph, but something more honest than either. Something that felt, when he played it through at the tempo it wanted, like exactly the right ending for the piece this concerto had always been trying to be. He sat with his hands on the keys after the 22 measures ended, in the space where the rest would be. He could hear it coming. He didn't know yet how many sessions, how many early mornings, how many days of carrying it before it arrived. But he could hear it. That was new. That was enough. He got up, locked the room, and went to pick up his daughter from Mrs. Okafor's apartment, where she had apparently spent the afternoon attempting to teach Mrs. Okafor's cat to respond to her name, with limited success. Lily reported this with detailed analysis of where the experiment had gone wrong and what she'd try differently next time. And Liam listened the whole way home and made dinner and helped with homework and did the dishes and thought about the third movement and didn't think about it, both at the same time, the way the mind holds a problem even when you're not looking at it, turning it over in the dark. He fell asleep before 10, which was early for him these days. He slept deeply and without the specific quality of restlessness that had characterized most nights for the past 3 years. In the morning, he got up before 6 and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his coffee and his headphones, and he wrote. The 23rd measure arrived, and then the 24th, and then a passage of 5 measures together that he played through twice and didn't change, which was unusual. He changed everything at least twice, because it was right the first time. Outside the kitchen window, the city was dark and beginning to lighten. Lily was asleep. The coffee was getting cold. He picked up the mug without looking at it and kept writing, and the music came in the way it came when it was ready, which was not gently but insistently, like something that has been waiting a long time and has decided it is done with patience. He wrote until 7:15 when he heard Lily's alarm go off in her room. He took off the headphones and looked at what was on the screen. 41 measures of the third movement, rough and real and structurally sound. The shape of the ending visible and close. He saved the file. He named it for the first time. He'd been leaving it untitled since January, a superstition about naming things before they were ready. He named it Now, for what keeps playing. He made Lily's breakfast and heard her moving around in her room and thought about April, which was 6 weeks away. He thought about the Harmon Philharmonic and James Whitfield and the benefit concert and whether 41 measures would become a finished third movement in 6 weeks, which was uncertain, which was the condition of all things worth finishing. He thought it would. He thought he knew now what the ending needed to say and that the saying of it was within reach. He had been wrong about things like this before and might be wrong again, but he thought it. When Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair sideways and her elephant under her arm, she looked at him at the table with the laptop and the cold coffee and the expression of someone who had been up since before the sun. "You were writing music," she said. "Yeah." She climbed into her chair. "The good kind or the kind that makes you frustrated?" He looked at her across the kitchen table. "The good kind," he said. "I think, for the first time in a while, the good kind." She put her elephant on the table facing him, the direction it sat when he needed company, the private ritual of a 7-year-old who understood more than she was supposed to. "Good," she said, with the simple authority she always brought to this. Then, "Can I have eggs?" He made eggs. The morning was ordinary and complete, and underneath it, like a left hand holding steady while the melody found its way, the third movement kept going in the part of his mind that never stopped working, moving toward the ending that had been there all along, waiting for him to be ready to hear it. The concerto was finished on a Thursday evening in the third week of March, 22 days before the benefit concert. Liam didn't know it was finished until he played it through from the beginning, all 3 movements, without stopping, the way you read a letter from beginning to end before you decide what it says. And when the last chord of the third movement resolved and the room went quiet, he sat at the keyboard in his office with the afternoon light long gone and the alley outside the window dark, and understood that there was nothing more to add, not because it was perfect, because it was complete. Those were different things, and knowing the difference was something it had taken him years to learn, and several more years of not writing anything to remember. The third movement ended the way he'd heard it coming, not triumphantly, not with the kind of resolution that tied everything up and told the listener how to feel. It ended with the piano alone, a single melodic line in the right hand, unaccompanied, moving through the same harmonic territory the whole concerto had been circling since the first movement. And then it didn't resolve into arrival. It resolved into continuation. The final phrase didn't land. It opened, like a door left ajar rather than shut, like the suggestion of a next room rather than a conclusion. He'd been afraid for months that this ending was a failure of nerve, that he was leaving it open because he didn't know how to close it. He understood now, playing it through in the empty office with nobody to hear it, that the openness was the point. The concerto was not about arriving. It had never been about arriving. It was about the decision to keep going in the absence of guaranteed arrival, which was the only honest thing he knew how to say about the past 3 years of his life, and possibly the only honest thing he'd ever had to say about anything. He sat with his hands on the keys for a long time after the last note faded. Then he picked up his phone and called James Whitfield. "It's done," he said when Whitfield answered. A pause. "All 3 movements?" "Yes." "Can I hear it before the concert?" "You can hear it at the concert," Liam said. "Same as everyone else." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. "I'll tell the program director," he said. "We'll need the score by Monday." "You'll have it." He stayed in the office for another hour after the call, not playing, just sitting in the quiet with the finished thing. He had finished pieces before, many of them, in the years when finishing things was part of his professional identity, when completion was the expected outcome of effort and craft. But this one was different in a way he couldn't fully articulate, the way the things that cost the most are always different. You could measure the work by years or by what it moved through to get there, and the second measure was the one that mattered. He went home. Lily was asleep. Mrs. Okafor had left a note on the counter saying dinner was in the fridge, and that Lily had been fine and that she'd finished the horse book, which had apparently ended well. He read the note twice and then stood in the kitchen in his coat for a minute before remembering to take it off. He went to Lily's room. He did this sometimes, stood in the doorway and looked at her sleeping, not for long, just long enough to complete some internal accounting. She was 7 years old, and her hair was sideways on the pillow, and her elephant was tucked in beside her with the same consideration she extended to all beings in her orbit, animate or otherwise. He stood in the doorway and thought about what she had said once, months ago. "You should do it then," with the simple authority of someone for whom the logic was obvious and the hesitation was puzzling. She had been right. She was frequently right, which he found both humbling and clarifying. He went to bed. He slept without dreams, or at least without dreams he remembered, which amounted to the same thing. In the morning he got up and made breakfast and took Lily to school and went to work. And the work was what it always was, full and demanding and frequently frustrating and necessary in the specific way that things are necessary when they connect directly to something that matters. He had stopped needing the work to be comfortable. He needed it to be real. And it was. The 3 weeks between finishing the concerto and the benefit concert were the most concentrated period of the Foundation's first year. The 4 new partner schools had signed agreements in February, and the expanded curriculum was rolling out simultaneously across 6 locations, which meant 6 sets of instructors, 6 different populations of students, 6 different versions of the same fundamental question. What does this child have, and what does this child need to be shown in order to use it? He drove between schools twice a week, sat in on sessions, talked to instructors, made adjustments. He wrote grant applications in the evenings. He answered Adler's follow-up questions about the early music education materials he'd sent her, which had turned into a genuine ongoing correspondence that was heading towards something specific, though he didn't know yet what. Marcus was playing jazz standards by ear, which should not have been possible at 11 months of instruction, and was, which meant that Liam was quietly adjusting his assumptions about what was possible, a process he suspected was going to continue for some time. Sophie was working on Ravel. This had been Liam's suggestion and Sophie's immediate certain acceptance of it. Ravel's sonatine, the first movement, which was technically demanding and emotionally precise and required a specific quality of restraint that was harder to teach than expressiveness and rarer to find in a student. Sophie had the instinct for it. She had the instinct for most things he gave her, which was both gratifying and, occasionally, slightly unnerving. The responsibility of teaching someone who learns faster than you can plan. The Saturday before the concert, they worked for 2 hours on the Ravel's second movement, which was slower and more interior than the first. The kind of music that required you to know something about patience in order to play it correctly. Sophie had been approaching it too carefully, technically sound but emotionally held back, like she was afraid of what was in it. "You're protecting yourself from the piece," Liam said. Sophie lifted her hands from the keys. "What does that mean?" "You know what it means." A pause. "I don't want to play something I can't control." Music you can't control is the interesting kind. That's easy to say when you're not the one playing it. "I'm going to be the one playing it in 6 days in front of an audience of several hundred people," he said. "So I understand the concern." She turned toward him. "Are you scared?" He thought about lying. It would have been easy. A clean reassurance, the kind of thing adults gave children when the truth was complicated. "Yeah," he said. "Some." She absorbed this. "Why?" "Because the concerto is personal," he said. "Playing something personal in front of people means they see something real about you, and you can't control what they do with it. But you're still doing it." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned back to the keys and found the opening position of the second movement and played it. Not perfectly. There were still moments of over-control, places where she pulled back from the feeling before it could fully emerge. But there were also moments where she let go, where the music moved through her hands with the particular quality it had when she stopped managing it and started trusting it. And those moments were extraordinary in the way that 9-year-olds who understand patience are extraordinary. Rare and precise, and worth every frustrating minute of getting there. When she finished, he said, "Those 3 phrases in the middle, the ones you let happen." "I know," she said. "I felt them." "That's the whole movement, right there. The rest is just getting back to them." She played it again. The getting back was faster this time. By the third run-through, the protection was mostly gone, and what was left was a 9-year-old girl playing Ravel with the kind of emotional accuracy that took most pianists decades to develop, in a small room on a Saturday morning, with nobody watching except him. Victoria was in the hallway. She was always in the hallway now, on Saturday mornings. She'd stopped pretending to read her phone. After the lesson, while Sophie was getting her jacket, Victoria stepped into the doorway of the music room. She looked at him with the expression she'd been wearing more frequently in recent weeks, something that had shed several of its protective layers without becoming incautious. "She's going to play at the concert," Victoria said. "I've decided." He looked at her. "Have you asked her?" "Not yet." "I wanted to know what you thought first." "I think she can do it," he said. "I think she's ready for a real audience. She needs to understand that the music doesn't change because people are watching." "Does she know that?" "She's starting to. The Ravel today..." He paused, thinking about those 3 phrases. "She's getting there." Victoria leaned against the door frame. "What would she play?" "The Chopin Nocturne," he said. "She knows it from the inside out. It's the piece she understands the deepest." He paused. It's also the piece that she learned the most from. Letting her play it for people it's giving the thing back to where it came from. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Something in her face was doing the complicated, quiet thing it did when she was processing something that wasn't work, something that required a different part of her. "Okay," she said. "I'll ask her tonight." Sophie said yes before Victoria finished the sentence. The benefit concert for the Harmon Philharmonic's Arts Education Initiative was held on a Friday evening in April. The venue was the Harmon Concert Hall itself. 3,000 seats, acoustic engineering that cost more than most houses, the kind of room that had a specific quality of silence before the music started, a held breath quality, like the room itself was waiting. Liam arrived 2 hours early for rehearsal. He had rehearsed with the Philharmonic twice in the preceding 2 weeks. The orchestra run-through of the concerto, which had been necessary and strange and occasionally wonderful, the experience of hearing the piece he'd written in his kitchen at 5 in the morning expanded into something that filled a room. The musicians were good. The conductor, a compact, precise woman named Everts, who had opinions and was not shy about them, had asked him 3 questions about the third movement that were the 3 exactly right questions. And his answers had been sufficient, and after the second rehearsal she'd said, "This is a real piece of work," in a tone that left no room for politeness, which was the only kind of compliment he trusted. He stood on the stage alone for a few minutes before the orchestra arrived. The hall was empty, house lights still up, seats all dark velvet and waiting. He looked out at the rows and thought about the last time he'd stood on a stage, which had been in a different city, a different life. A version of himself that had been real and was also gone, the way things can be both simultaneously. He didn't feel grief about it, standing there. He felt something more like acknowledgement. Yes, that happened. Yes, it ended. Yes. Here is what came after, and after is not lesser. It is just different. It is just where the music went next. He sat at the piano. He played a single chord and let it ring in the empty hall and listened to the acoustics carry it, the way the room caught sound and held it before releasing it, and thought that this was one of the things about music that he had never been able to explain to people who didn't play, the way a room participates, the way the space is part of what happens. The orchestra arrived. Everts ran them through the concerto's first movement for timing and then let the rest go until the performance, which was her style. She trusted prepared musicians and didn't over-rehearse. Liam played through his sections and felt the piece settle into its performance shape, slightly different from its rehearsal shape in the way all living things shift when they understand they are being taken seriously. At 6:30, an hour before doors, he went backstage and changed and sat in the green room and tried to eat half a sandwich that he mostly didn't eat. His phone had messages from people he hadn't expected. Dana from the foundation, who had heard he was performing and said the students had made him a card that would be on his desk Monday morning. Mrs. Gaines from Marcus's school, a text that said simply, "Marcus told me. Go play." He read these and put his phone in his bag. His phone buzzed one more time. He looked at the screen. It was Lily. A photo. She was in the audience already. Mrs. Okafor had brought her early, per arrangement, and the photo was of the empty stage taken from what appeared to be the 5th row center. She'd added no caption because she was 7 and captions were not her medium. The image was slightly blurry and slightly sideways and was the most important thing he'd seen all day. He put his phone away and sat in the green room with the half-eaten sandwich and the sound of the orchestra warming up beyond the walls, and thought about nothing specifically, which was the closest he could get to the stillness he needed before he played. Victoria brought Sophie backstage at 6:45. Sophie was in a dark blue dress, well, not a formal gown, something more like a very good version of what she wore normally, which had been, Victoria had mentioned, a negotiation. Sophie had opinions about what she wore on stage that turned out to be quite specific and had required 2 shopping trips to resolve. She navigated the backstage corridor with her hand on Victoria's arm, not because she needed the guidance, but because she wanted the contact, which was a distinction that had taken Victoria some time to understand and that she now understood clearly. She was carrying the elephant keychain in her free hand. Not her bag, just the keychain, held between her fingers. Her version of a talisman, which she would have denied if asked. When she found Liam by his voice in the green room, she stood in front of him and said, "Are you still scared?" "Still some," he said. "You?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "I'm scared that the music won't sound like it does when I play it alone," she said, "that people being there will change it." "People being there does change it," he said. "It makes it more, not less. The music goes somewhere when someone hears it. That's the whole point of playing it." She considered this. Like, how the room participates? He looked at her. He hadn't said that to her. He'd thought it an hour ago, sitting at the piano alone in the empty hall. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like that." She nodded once, certain, and handed the elephant keychain to Victoria without explanation and said she was ready. Victoria looked at the keychain in her hand and then at her daughter's back as Sophie moved toward the stage door, and something in her face was open in a way that people's faces rarely are in public, a layer down from the composed surface she wore most of the time, something unmanaged and genuine and slightly undone. She caught Liam looking and didn't correct the expression. She just let it be what it was. "She's going to be wonderful," he said. "I know," Victoria said. It came out with more emotion than she'd intended, and she didn't walk it back. Sophie performed third on the program, before the intermission. She walked to the piano with Marguerite guiding her to the bench, and Marguerite stepped back, and Sophie sat down and found the keys and adjusted her position, and then was still for a moment that stretched long enough that a person in the fourth row later told someone it was the most powerful thing about the whole evening. The stillness of her before she played, the absolute interior quality of it. A 9-year-old collecting herself in front of 3,000 people with the composure of someone who had decided, somewhere private, that the music was worth whatever this cost. She played the Chopin Nocturne. It was not a flawless performance. The tempo wavered in one spot in the middle section, and she overcorrected briefly before finding it again. One ornament in the final phrase came out slightly rushed. These were the marks of a real performance by a real person under real conditions, and they made it more true, not less. But the left hand knew it wasn't going home. She played it exactly as she'd described it, knowing from the beginning, playing anyway. And 3,000 people who had not been told anything about this child or her story, or the music room on the 42nd floor, or the janitor who had heard her struggling and sat down beside her and shown her where Dee actually was, felt something move in the hall that was not sentimental and was not easy to explain. Liam was in the wings. He watched her play. He thought about the first night, the barely cracked door, the broken Schumann, the small voice saying, "You know where Dee is." He thought about the chord resolving after 6 days of not resolving. He thought about all the Sophies, all the children in all the rooms who were saying to themselves, you know, just reach, and whether anyone was going to sit down beside them, and whether the foundation's work was large enough and good enough, and whether the curriculum would do what he believed it could do. He didn't know. He knew he was going to keep trying to find out. Sophie finished. The hall was quiet for a moment. Not the uncertainty of an audience that doesn't know how to respond, but the different silence of people who need a second before they can move. Then the applause came, and it was real and sustained, and Liam watched Sophie stand from the bench and bow in the direction of the sound, with a slight smile that was not performed and not humble, just honest. The smile of someone who has played the thing they needed to play in front of the people who were there to hear it, and the hearing has happened, and that is enough. Victoria, in the front row center, was on her feet. She was not the first person standing, but she was standing before most of the orchestra level, and she was not, for once, managing her expression at all. She clapped, and her face was fully open, and she was not thinking about the quarterly projections or the board or the partnership agreements or any of the 12,000 things that moved through her mind on any given day. She was watching her daughter take a bow, and she was present for it, completely and without reservation, in the way she had been learning, slowly, imperfectly, with significant backsliding on difficult weeks, to be present for things that mattered. Marguerite, 3 seats down, was crying and not bothering to conceal it. Sophie came off stage. She found Liam in the wings by his breathing. She'd told him once that she knew where people were by how they breathed, which he'd believed immediately and filed his information about what it meant to truly pay attention to the world. She walked to him and stopped close. "How was it?" she said. "Real," he said. It was real. She nodded. This was enough. She leaned against the wall beside him, and they stood together in the wings while the next performer went on, and Sophie listened to the music from the stage with the same total body attention she brought to everything, and Liam stood beside her and breathed and waited for his own part of the evening. The concerto was the second half's anchor. He walked on stage to applause that was warm but not yet personal. He was not well known here, was not the primary draw for most of the audience, and sat at the piano and looked at Evarts and gave her the nod that meant ready, and she raised her baton, and the orchestra began. The first movement went the way first movements do when a piece has been prepared correctly and the room is right, cleanly, with the specific momentum of something that knows where it's going. He played and listened simultaneously, the split attention that performance required, tracking his own hands and the orchestra and the room all at once. The second movement was slower, and he let it be slow, let the phrases breathe, let the silences be actual silences rather than spaces he felt compelled to fill. And then the third movement. He played the opening bars alone, piano without orchestra, the way the movement began, establishing the territory before anything else entered. The hall was quiet, in the particular way it goes quiet when people feel that something is happening. He played the first section through, the orchestra coming in gradually, building the architecture of the thing he'd written in early mornings and late nights over months, the thing that had been in him for 3 years looking for a way out. And when he got to the passage that he'd written the night after Sophie played the nocturne for the first time, the passage he'd heard her describe and then found in the music before he found it in words, he felt something happen in the hall that was not describable in technical terms. It was the thing rooms do when music is telling them something true. 3,000 people breathing at the same rate for a moment, without knowing they were. The movement didn't arrive. It opened. The last phrase lifted rather than landed, the final chord hanging in the acoustic space of the hall, and then Liam lifted his hands from the keys and there was silence. And in the silence, the question the music had been asking stood fully formed in the air of the room. The silence lasted longer than silences usually last. Then the hall came apart. Not the gradual building of polite appreciation. The kind of applause that means something was heard. He sat at the piano and let it happen and looked at his hands on the keys. The rough knuckles, the cracked thumb, the long, careful fingers that had played in empty apartments at 5 in the morning and in a corporate music room at midnight and in a gymnasium in the Riverside district and in a small office with afternoon light, and thought about what it meant to be made of all the things that had happened to you, even the ones you wouldn't have chosen. He stood and bowed. He looked out at the hall. In the 5th row center, slightly blurry, slightly sideways in her seat, from leaning over to see Lily. 7 years old, standing on her seat with Mrs. Okafor's hand steadying her, clapping as hard as her arms would go, her face lit up with the unself-conscious joy of a child watching her parent do the thing they were supposed to do. He held that image for a long moment. He kept it. After the concert, there was a reception in the lobby, the kind of arts event gathering where the wine is decent and the conversations are a mix of genuine and performative in proportions that shift depending on where you're standing. He moved through it and talked to people and accepted congratulations that he received as genuinely as he could, which varied. He talked to Adler for 15 minutes about her granddaughter, who was now enrolled in a trial of the early music program he'd developed, and Adler used the word transformative, which he generally distrusted and in this context believed. He talked to James Whitfield, who shook his hand and said the third movement was unexpected, which Liam took as the compliment it was intended to be. He talked to Marcus's mother, Dana, who was there because Marcus was there. Marcus, who had been seated in the second balcony and who found Liam after the performance with the specific expression of someone who has heard something that has rearranged something internal and doesn't yet have the words for it. "The ending," Marcus said. "Why doesn't it close?" "Because it's not over," Liam said. Marcus thought about this very carefully. Then he nodded, the nod of someone who understands something they couldn't have articulated before it was shown to them. "Okay," he said. "Yeah." He found Sophie and Victoria near the edge of the reception, Sophie with a glass of sparkling water that she was holding without drinking, Victoria with one hand resting on Sophie's shoulder in the absence of thought way that meant it had become natural rather than chosen. Sophie heard him coming and turned. "The third movement," she said. "I heard it from backstage." "I know. It doesn't close." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "Because it's not supposed to," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She thought about this. "It's like the left hand in the nocturne," she said finally. "It knows it's not going home, and it plays anyway." He looked at her, 9 years old, blue dress, the elephant keychain back in her hand, standing in the lobby of a concert hall where 3,000 people had just heard something true. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what it is." Victoria watched this exchange without speaking. She was doing the thing she'd been learning, being present without managing, letting moments happen without reaching to shape them. She looked at her daughter, and she looked at Liam, and she thought about Friday evenings a year ago, when Sophie had been alone in a music room and she had been 6 floors down in a meeting and neither of them had known what was missing. She thought about the door that had been cracked open and what it had taken to walk through it and who had held it for whom and how you could never fully untangle that kind of thing, and it didn't matter anyway. "Lily is looking for you," Victoria said to Liam. "Mrs. Okafor has her by the punch bowl and she's been very still for someone her age, which means she's planning something." He laughed, a real one. The kind that came without preparation. "I should go find her," he said. "You should," Victoria said. Then, "Liam." He stopped. She was looking at him with the expression that had been building across the months. The one without the protective layers. The one that was simply her, looking at him directly and without the intermediary of professional distance. "What you built this year," she said. "The foundation. The kids. The curriculum. This." She gestured slightly toward the hall behind them, toward the lingering aftermath of the evening. "I hired you because I thought you knew music. I didn't know yet that you knew what music was for." He held that for a moment. He thought about the right response and decided there wasn't one that was as true as just receiving what she'd said. "Sophie knew," he said. "She always knew. That first night, she wasn't just playing. She was saying something. I just happened to walk by when she was saying it." Victoria looked at him. "No," she said quietly. "You stopped. Other people would have kept walking. You stopped." They were quiet for a moment. The reception moved around them, conversations and glasses, and the particular ambient noise of people at a cultural event being glad they came. Somewhere by the punch bowl, Lily was apparently executing whatever she'd been planning, because there was a brief burst of surprised laughter from Mrs. Okafor. "I'll see you Monday," Victoria said. "Monday," he agreed. He went to find his daughter. She was not, as it turned out, at the punch bowl. She had migrated to the edge of the room where a small display of student artwork from the Foundation's partner schools had been arranged, drawings and paintings by children enrolled in the expanded programs. She was standing in front of a large, colorful painting by a 12-year-old student named Amara, who attended the East Side School, which was a painting of hands on piano keys in vivid, somewhat anatomically creative colors. Lily was studying it with the full gravity she brought to things that interested her. "You found me," Liam said. "I heard you," she said, without turning. "Your shoes." He stood beside her and looked at the painting. The hands in it were too large for the keys, and the keys were the wrong proportions, and the colors were impossible. And it was completely right in the way that art made by someone who felt something is always completely right, regardless of technical accuracy. "Do you know whose that is?" Lily asked. "A student named Amara. She's 12. "It looks like she loves it," Lily said. "Piano, you can tell." "Yeah," he said, "you can." Lily looked at it for another moment. Then she took his hand. Not the way she took it when she needed something, but the way she took it when she was just claiming the fact of him, the simple fact of his presence beside her, which was its own complete thing. He held her hand, and they stood in front of Amara's impossible, colorful painting, and the reception moved around them, and the evening was almost over. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah." "I liked the ending, the part where it didn't close." He looked down at her, 7 years old, her mother's eyes, her grandmother's stubbornness, the rabbit keychain on her backpack across the room. "You understood that?" he said. "It means it keeps going," she said simply. "Right?" He tightened his hand around hers. "Yeah," he said. "That's right. It keeps going." She leaned against his side, comfortable and unself-conscious, and they stood there for a while longer. He didn't think about the concerto or the foundation or the board meeting or the termination report or the 42nd floor or the years that had felt like getting something wrong without knowing what the right answer was. He thought about none of it and all of it simultaneously, the way you hold the whole shape of something when you're finally far enough inside it to see the edges. He thought about a door cracked open in a building where he used to push a mop cart, the broken melody coming through, the decision. Barely a decision, more like a response to something the body knew before the mind did, to stop walking and push the door open. He thought about all the doors that looked closed that were actually just cracked. All the children on the other side of them, working through the same 4 bars, saying to themselves, "You know where it is, you know, just reach." All the things that were still playing, whether anyone stopped to listen or not. He stood with his daughter in the lobby of the Harmon Concert Hall while the evening finished itself around them and held her hand and listened to what kept playing. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the way that only certain things are, the chord resolving, the door opening, the left hand holding steady while the melody found